Dusty, I'm glad to have you on the show.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited about this conversation. I have been reading your book and looking at some of the stuff you've been doing in the training community and law enforcement, and I'm excited to talk about that and break that down for the audience.
Awesome. Let's do it.
So this is the first time we met.
It is.
Which is great.
We met like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah. So briefly, can you talk about yourself, talk about how, your background, and then how you got into what you're doing with building shooters?
Yeah. So went to the Naval Academy. Was on a shooting team there, which gave me, I wouldn't say we were really good shooters, but at least kind of a professional, level if I can not shoot myself. Coming out of the academy. You're a Marine, as I understand it. So you're the men's department of the Navy, as they call it. So at the time, small arms skills were not something the Navy really valued at all. So graduated, went to Buds, quit in Hell Week, and then ended up going into the surface fleet. And so we had much to my, I don't say amazement really, but it was kind of amazement. Like you would not necessarily even get bullets going on watch. Sometimes just a gun. None of the guns were loaded. Et cetera, et cetera. And so after the USS Cole got blown up, one of the things that came out of that, and not that it really probably would have made a difference, right, but that nobody had loaded guns pulling into Yemen. And so, big organizations making, knee-jerk responses. Like, everybody's going to load the guns on whatever date it was. So I just happened to be the gunnery officer through no particular... wasn't like that happened for any particular reason, right? But I just happened to be the gunnery officer on a frigate, and so I was like, oh, I know how to do this. So got together a training plan, requested some ridiculous amount of ammunition, and the Navy was like, yeah, no, we're not giving you that ammo. So I think to start I had 2,000 rounds for 200 people for a year.
Oh my gosh!
Right, it's like 10 rounds a person, not even enough. Yeah, not even enough to shoot the qual course, right? So then I went down to the on-base range, and they were like, yeah, we don't have any range time available. Like, I'm making these dates up because I don't remember. But let's say it was load all the guns is August 15th. They're like, we don't have any range days, including on the weekends, until, like, November. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not what I was looking for,
Wow.
So what I ended up doing, and it wasn't because I thought it was good or because it was what I thought we should do. I just came up with an 8-hour dry fire program, and it wasn't like 8 consecutive hours, although I would have preferred that at the time. That I couldn't get the sailors. It wasn't their job. It was just security watch, collateral duty everybody has to do. And so I taught this 8-hour dry fire program. It was broken up over 8 1-hour blocks to, I wouldn't say everybody, but a lot of the crew, and then was eventually able to get a little bit of range time for folks. So I did that. Was on the frigate for 3 years, and then pre-commissioned a mobile security detachment when they stood that up, which is, I don't think the command exists anymore in that form, but we were the first active component of what's now Expeditionary Warfare Group.
Okay.
And I've been out of that game so long, I have no idea what that all looks like. But we had our entire mission was security specific there, so I still had to fight with the Navy to, get kind of the basic resources because it's the Navy. Imagine the Navy reinventing the Marine Corps without asking the Marine Corps anything. It was exactly like that. It took me almost a year to convince them that everybody needed a rifle. It was pretty awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
That long.
And then once they did that, it took me more time to convince them that we needed magazines for the rifles. It was like, it was... Again, the surface Navy reinventing the Marine Corps without talking to the Marines.
That's wild.
It was pretty wild. I'm squirreling because I squirrel on these things. But so I ran into a Marine major that I knew at the academy at like a football game or something. During this whole process, and I was like, hey, like surely there's some documentation because everybody wants documentation and references, right?
Sure.
When you're trying to justify stuff, like if we're going to bad guy land, everybody should have a gun, right? Like that seems straightforward, but no, but apparently not. So this guy was awesome. He was a Marine infantry officer, Major Murphy, Tim Murphy, and he's like, let me see what I can do. I'm sure the Marine Corps has references, right? So he gets back to me like a week later. He's like, so you found something so fundamental, even the Marine Corps hasn't felt the need to write a reference for it.
This is so self-evident.
That's right. Even the Marine Corps didn't write it down. I was like,
wow,
awesome.
that's remarkable.
But anyway, so got there, and the command was mostly mastered arms, which for anyone that's not familiar with that, that's the Navy's version of a military policeman.
Mm-hmm.
So the majority of the command was already a badged qualified police officer, or federal police officer, qualified on weapons and all of that. And we went through, depending on, because everybody got a little bit different school package, but everybody went through between like 5 and 6 weeks of weapons training at the command, like dedicated weapons stuff. And then I got them after that for a advanced weapons training block that I put together. And so when most of the command, again, who are already, even before they showed up, military police officers, most of them still didn't have a consistent grip on the handgun when they showed up in my class. And I was like, we're doing something wrong, right? Like in terms of like a process standpoint, right? The mechanisms that we're doing are not working correctly, because in 6 weeks, I'll give you a consistent grip. I'm not saying you're going to challenge Rob Latham for the world championship or anything, but like you'll hold the gun consistently. And so that's kind of what got me interested in how we train and what training processes look like. And why what we were doing as an organization was so ineffective, right? Because you're just pouring resources down the drain at that point, right? When it's like, well, we spent all this time teaching people to make them ready to go do this job, potentially in combat, and they're not good, and it's not their fault they're not good at that point. It's our fault, right?
Yeah.
Like if you've got 100 people and one of them's terrible, maybe it's that guy's fault. If you have 100 people and 100 of them are terrible, it's your fault. Right, if you're the trainer, you're the person in charge of that. So anyway, so that's what kind of started me spinning down the rabbit hole. So I started looking comparatively at what did I do on the ship, and why were the guys on the ship comparative to the guys at mobile security, right? And the guys at mobile security were a little better, but they had a ton more training. And so why am I getting what could be considered comparable results between 8 hours of dry fire training with like 1 day on the range and 6 weeks of training for people who are already cops before they showed up, right?
Yeah.
Like that's wrong. That's wrong, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't have that. And so I just started tweaking the training methodology. I went into the high threat contracting thing after I got out. And so when I'd be back from deployment, I'd always grab somebody and be like, hey, you want to learn to shoot, right? And started trying to come up with a process that worked. So I came up with something that worked fairly well. I was able to produce pretty consistent results with students. It was relatively low resource. The training program was kind of aimed at, it'd be like an advanced concealed carry thing. And the concept at the time was let's prove that this works just by, here's our students, watch them shoot, right? Like not really anything other than that. And then being able to show, well, this is the resources that went into this, which is a lot less than what you're doing, and then try to transfer that into the professional side. That was the original concept. Can
you share some of the, I guess, maybe tenets of that program and like what separated it from what they were doing, and why it worked so well?
Yeah, I mean, so the basic, I mean, the basic components of it is that you don't deliver people more information than they're capable of learning. And then you incorporate the limitations of the memory system, right? Which is, not giving them more than they can absorb. And then also consider, and I didn't understand at the time why it worked, right? I just kind of trial and errored my way into doing it. But you're also having to repeat things enough that the information is actually going into the long-term memory system. And so if you think about a lot of our traditional training processes, right, in our traditional training models, and it's everywhere, right? It's the civilian side and military and law enforcement as well, but particularly on the civilian side, everything's modeled around like the 1 day or the 2 day class, right? Or at least traditionally it has been. And so you're going into a program where most of us are not really capable of learning more than about 20 minutes of new information in a day if it's stuff that's brand new to us. So what are you doing for the other 7 hours and 40 minutes of this 8 hour day, right? Like it's not anything productive. And often it's, you're basically wiping out whatever that productivity was.
And for the listeners, you're talking about the brain's capacity to retain information.
The brain's capacity to retain information, right? So that's kind of the first piece. And then as far as the brain retaining information, once I got into the neuroscience side of it, which is I had a friend of mine who was working at the Air Force Research Laboratory as a research neuroscientist. I taught a home defense shotgun class for her, and she was like, what you're doing is actually really cutting edge in the neuroscience side. And I knew nothing at the time about that stuff. And she was like, go look up these couple of subjects. And so I set out to write a 10-page, white paper or whatever. And so like 3.5 years later and 200 something pages of research, I had what became that book.
Yeah.
Which was the first book, Building Shooters. So, but yeah, so the kind of the basic tenets, right? Like if we give people more information, then they can get into that short-term memory system, then, we're either pushing something else out of it or we're corrupting the information that's already there. And then in order for information, and this is particularly relevant for these kinds of skills, right? For tactical stuff and shooting, anything that's going to happen as the stress levels go up is that we need to put the information into the memory system that your brain can access under stress, because we have multiple memory systems and we can't get to all of that under stress. Right. And so anybody that's listening to this, like pretty much everybody could do, whatever, some level of math that's relatively easy for you, but requires you to kind of stop and think about it to do. It's one thing to do that if you're sort of sitting there by yourself. It's another thing when you got 3 people screaming at you and you're driving down the road, right? Like it's 2 different things, right?
Yep.
The more distraction you have, the more
Right.
difficult it is to access parts of the brain. And of course that, everybody's kind of experienced that at some level. So, and so once I got into the neuroscience side and doing that research, right, there is a memory system called the procedural system, which is, effectively where unconscious competence comes from, right? That's a term that's been around for forever in the industry. And if we don't put the skills there, they're not going to happen.
And that's like slamming the brake in a car. If you like, that comes from that system, correct? Like you see the car in front of you, their brake lights, and you hit your brake. That oh crap moment. Is that coming from? That's coming from the procedural system, right?
That's probably coming from the procedural system, unless you're a student driver, right?
Okay, yeah.
I mean, once you've done something, right? That's one of the ways to get stuff in the procedural memory, right? Is you do something with enough repetition, and the brain will put it in the procedural memory. So anyway, that's just kind of the basic, my background, where I came from, and how I kind of started down this rabbit hole.
Yeah.
If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to use deadly force to defend yourself or to defend someone else, then you're going to want a good legal team defending you after the fact. And that's why I trust attorneys on retainer. And if you want to see how AOR compares to those other CCW insurance providers, then scan this QR code or check out my affiliate link in the description. They have individual and family plans so that you will be legally protected should you ever need to protect your life or someone else's life. And don't forget to use promo code DAD to save $25 on your initial sign up.
And so, did you start your company Building Shooters while you were still in the Navy, or
No.
when you got out? Okay.
No. So when I wrote the first book, Building Shooters, and I'm not that creative, so that's what I named the company. I never really looked at it as something that would be a vocation. Like when in 2000, let's see, what year was it? The first time I quit going overseas and we tried to do this as a business was 2009, I think. 2009, I think, is when we started Seal Mindset. 2009, 2010. That was a joint venture with a guy I'd gone to the academy with, and then a range company in Minneapolis. We didn't. The training worked really well, but the commercial aspect of it didn't work real well, or at least we didn't find the formula before we kind of ran out of money. So I left, went back overseas. He stuck with it for a while. And then I think it's actually still going. I think it's called Defensive Mindset Training now, up in the Minneapolis area. But so I went back overseas, got into the research side, looking at at least like reading about the neuroscience, and figured out there's this kind of whole other world out there, as far as understanding what's going on in the brain. Wrote Building Shooters. And at that point, I never looked at it as anything that would be commercial. I am passionate about training, and particularly for armed professionals, right? Because that's kind of my background. And it's really terrible to be asked to send 80 people to war and be told you can't have anything you need to send them there, right? It's like, well, got to find ways to fix this and do a better job. So that's kind of where where all that comes from. But I never looked at it as a viable commercial thing, because it's for all the guys that are out there that are trainers, you understand this, right? You got to do what people are going to give you money for if you do it for a living. People aren't usually going to give you money when you stand up and you're like, hey, everything you do is wrong, right? It's you have to spend a lot of groundwork before you get to the point where people are going to pay you to do that.
Yeah.
And so I didn't ever look at it as something that would be commercial. So after I wrote Building Shooters, I started looking at what are the barriers to implementation, because there are some, right? There are reasons we do things the way we do. A lot of them are logistical. A lot of them have to do with, you know, processes and, you know, in agencies, right? Even a lot of it's related to like HR and stuff that has nothing to do with the tactics and shooting and stuff. You know, even necessarily resources. It's just, you know, HR and assumptions other people make and, you know, policies and all that kind of stuff. So like, what are the barriers to being able to implement training processes that are much more efficient and effective? And, you know, I'm summarizing this at a much, you know, kind of a 30,000 foot level right now. But basically what I came up with was, we've got kind of like two fundamental flaws in what we do, right? The first one is training delivery doesn't match how we learn. And there's a lot of rabbit holes to dive into off of that, right? But that's kind of the high level one. And the second one is that our measurement systems are terrible. So, like, you know, everybody knows that the qualifications we do are kind of useless, but we still do them. And the mandatory is always going to shape the resource expenditures and the time use, right? And so it's like we dedicate our resources to doing something that's totally irrelevant and useless and doesn't give us any useful information. But nonetheless, we still do it. Everybody complains about it and then does it. I gave a.
You gotta check that box.
We got to check that box. So it's funny. I gave in 2018. I gave a speech at the FBI Academy, the Firearms Instructor Conference in the National Academy. So then afterwards, like right after the speech, I went back with the firearms instructors, and they were having a, you know, because it's their annual conference, and there's all like, you know, 60 PFIs or however many the Bureau has were in there. And they started talking about the qual course. So there was like the first half hour was about how useless the whole thing is, and then the next hour and a half was how they were going to tweak it. You know, it was abstractly, because I didn't have a dog in the fight. It was sort of humorous to watch, right? Like I would have been exactly in there doing the same thing they were doing. So it's not a criticism on them. It was just like from the outside looking in, it was like, this is kind of hilarious.
It's like watching an episode of Parks and Rec or something.
Yeah, exactly.
This
it's
is
like
government.
Exactly. This is the government at work. So kind of in that, you know, coming to that realization, like these are kind of the big areas that we got to change. And, you know, the measurement side being a real one, right? Because we just didn't have a way to measure things in a way that was relevant. And then I saw an online argument that I got tagged in. This is before like Facebook totally went off the rails and became like, you know, a censor book or whatever. But I got tagged in this. I didn't participate because I got like misquoted, you know, in this thing. But I ended up, and I don't even remember who it was, but it was like two guys, and then their acolytes started fighting it out, you know, in like the comment section on this thing, you know. And I'm reading all this, and I'm like, you know, both sides in this discussion are actually, at least from my standpoint, both sides in this discussion are making good points, but they are kind of talking past each other. You know, and there's reasons that happened too, right? But it kind of like dawned on me that we just don't have a tool. We just don't have a tool that allows us to measure things that matter. And so that's when I came up with the idea for Neuro. So that's when I started the company, because I was like, well, if we have physical products to sell, and then there's software and all the rest of that stuff, that actually could be a business that could make money. So that's when I started as a business instead of just doing it as a hobby.
And so, okay, so the Neuro came along. How did the development of that go? Like, when did the inspiration hit you of like, this is the device? Obviously, I know that those design phases go through several iterations and
many
evolutions. But what was like the first thing that you thought, like, the genesis of this idea?
So it actually was quite a process. I mean, the basic idea was just that we don't have any way to measure how we respond to a visual stimulus, and then we always predefine what we do so we can control what we do, right? And neither of those things are like that. Basically makes most of what we do tactically irrelevant. And you know, but in the process of figuring all that out, right? Basically what I did is I went and I did, and this is not trying to sell books here, but this is all kind of like laid out in the book Neuro, which is a very, very painful book to read, right? But it's kind of all laid out there. I did an analysis and said, like, from the perspective of what's going on in the brain, right? From neurological function, what are the physical things that we need to do, right, in a tactical environment? What are the tactical things that we need to do? what does the training process look like, and then what does the learning process look like? Because those are all different things, right? Training and learning should be symbiotic, but they're actually two different things.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so I laid all that out and then said, okay, like our objective in training, and this is something I'd learned, from building shooters, or from the process of writing that book, right, and kind of doing that research, right? Our objective in training is really to build brain circuitry in the right part of the brain, right? Because that's where our physical performance comes from. That's what's going to make us go perform. And the research for building shooters showed me that we largely do have the ability to impact that, right? Like, because we understand, at least at a high level, what those mechanisms are that build brain circuitry, right? And what activities will build brain circuitry, and how we can build things in specific parts of the brain. And so that should be how we design our training, is to build what I call the combat circuit board, right? Because that's what we're physically building circuitry in the brain for performance. And since we know the parameters and we know the mechanisms on how to construct the circuitry, what we got to do first is figure out what that circuit board needs to look like, and then we just go about building it. And that's not something that we've traditionally done a very good job at, right? Like when you get into the military, I was actually talking to one of my Navy classmates this weekend about this, right? Like on the higher level, like training design side for the military stuff, I've always had the medals, right? Mission essential task lists, and then mission performance standards, right? And you kind of break those things down and disseminate it out. But we have largely ignored, or almost completely ignored, the learning side of it, right? Like, what are the mechanisms that we actually use to construct the circuitry? And we've also ignored in those training design processes, at least for everything that I've seen, right? Is that what are the neurological things that we have to do to perform this skill, right? Because we can say, like, okay, I need to operate a weapon system, pick whatever it is, right? For M2, Beretta, M4, whatever. I need to operate this weapon system. And we look at that in the training environment of what do I need to do to operate this weapon system on a range, right, in a sterile range environment. But that doesn't necessarily incorporate all the things that my brain has to do, my brain and body have to do to operate that weapon system in a fight. And so if we ignore that, then we're not building a circuit board that's going to work, right? Like if I'm like, hey, all I have to do with this in training is, like if I have a car and all I have to do is drive it 10 feet forward and hit stop, well, I don't need a windshield on that car. I don't need blinkers, and I don't need a steering wheel. I just need a brake and a gas pedal. And so if we build a car with just a brake and a gas pedal with no steering wheel, no windshield, and no, blinkers and no side mirrors, it'll do that, right? But it's not going to do super well on the highway.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so understanding what the components of the circuit board that we need to build are, and then how do we go about doing that? And the way that we construct neural circuitry without getting into the weeds on it, right, is we use it, right? We have to use those functions. And then as we use them and the brain struggles to make things happen, it's like, all right, I'm struggling to do this. And I now realize this is important because it's been done enough, or there's been emotion involved. And so now I'm going to start building stuff, right? The brain actually physically builds circuitry to make those things happen. And we can't build the circuitry if we don't use it, right?
Yeah.
So if it's like, oh, I want you to be able to shoot accurately, and I also want you to be able to see, 180 degrees of vision while you're shooting accurately. If I don't give you something to see at 180 degrees, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
Because, there's no task that requires you to do it. And so it's about how do we provide that stimulation and create training environments that enable us to build the combat relevant circuit board in a training setting, and how do we do it in a way that is scalable and cost effective, right? Because the $10 million solution is not a solution because it's not affordable, right? And a component of the training is not going and having a small experience. Or an effective training isn't, right. It requires repetition over time, because that's how you construct neural circuitry. And so if we have training devices and processes and systems that don't match up with how we construct brain circuitry, then we're not actually training. And there's a lot of rabbit holes going on that too. So anyway, so that was kind of what, like, all of that research really predated the development of the device, right? And some of it was concurrent, but as far as like how the device was built, what the features of it were, all of that was kind of up front. And then it was like, okay, what's the cheapest, most scalable way that's going to actually match with real training environments and where people are, and what stuff people need to be able to do and the environments they need to be able to do it in. What's the cheapest, most scalable, most cost-effective way to do this? And that's kind of what led to the development of neuro.
I like that. And I like earlier that you juxtaposed education with training. And can we touch on that again and just kind of tease out those differences?
Yeah.
Because I think that's very important. And
Right,
it
100%.
drove me crazy in law enforcement when they would call it in-service training. It was not in-service training. It was may have been in-service education, but most of it was just refresher.
Right.
Right. There's no training element. Even our use of force training was a PowerPoint.
Right.
And so can you discuss those two and why it's important to distinguish them independently?
Yeah. So training, at least the way I mean, you could probably come up with a million definitions, but the way I think of it is training is what you're doing is on the instructor side, right? It's like how the curriculum is structured and how you're delivering things. And then learning is what's going on in the student's brain. And, you know, I say this quite frequently, right? People get really excited about, you know, training settings or something that's super cool. And it's like, don't look at what's going on around the student. Look at what the student's doing and process out what is this happening in the student's brain. Because the only important thing, the only thing of relevance that happens during a training environment, whether it be a simulation or skill building or whatever it is, happens behind the eyes and between the ears of the student. That's it. Everything else is completely superfluous. Doesn't matter. Has no impact. So, and not that those other things can't impact what's going on behind the eyes and between the ears, but it,
That's the whole point.
yeah, but that's the whole point, because what's going on between the ears of the student is what's going to build circuitry. And if you don't have circuitry at the end of the day, then you've just wasted your time and you've wasted the resources. And so we can do, and we often do. I've actually been thinking about this. Like, we're starting to kind of like design and develop some training stuff now. And I'm not the most dynamic presenter. You know, there's another guy that I'm doing some work with now, and like neither one of us is very good at the presentation side, right? It's just we both have a track record of producing very, very good results with students, but not so much being the, you know, very entertaining, like dynamic presenters. And so I kind of think about that as far as like everything that if you go into like the education and like the instructor world and all that, everything's focused on how do we do a more dynamic and effective presentation, right? But you kind of lose the student with that. And I'm not saying those things aren't important, and I need to get better at them 100%. But a very dynamic, entertaining presenter doesn't necessarily produce learning, right? Particularly for the types of skills that we're talking about. And so
It's a very delicate balance, because if you're just entertaining, it's a balance between entertainment and then
Right.
training. I call it like intertraining. It's
Yeah.
like kind of a balance.
Well, there's, I mean, in the civilian market particularly, there's a commercial aspect to it, right? Because people are not like, I had a friend, a guy I worked with overseas that broke this down. He had some time in like the long gun training world. He was a Marine sniper, and he said it just summed it up perfectly. He's like, people don't pay to learn. They don't care. They don't actually need these skills for the most part. They don't really care. They pay for entertainment. They pay for a cool experience. And then a distant third is whether or not they learn anything. Right. And we definitely found that like in the SEAL mindset thing, where people are like, well, I don't understand. Like, why would I show up 10 times if I can just show up for half a day over here and get the same thing? Right. Or this, you know, go to this guy's thing and do like John Woo rolls and, you know, whatever. It's like, well,
Right.
maybe this over here actually makes you worse. They're like, oh, but it's fun. Like, okay.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know? And so, yeah, there's definitely, at least from my standpoint, like training is sort of like the activity, and it doesn't have to be good training, right? Like not all training is good training. A lot of training's not. And not all learning is good learning either, or, you know, it's not necessarily positive learning. But ideally what we do is we design and we match up our training processes with the mechanisms in the brain that are going to produce neural circuitry that's going to give us combat performance. Right?
And so you're talking about the actual real world, or at least as close to as possible, and that phrase real world, stimuli that's occurring.
Actually, so that's actually an interesting thing too. I've got a whole bunch of new research I'm working on right now on this subject, right? So what you just said has been the assumption for a long time, right? And it's way that, and this is actually part of why I never wanted to run a company, never really wanted to have products or whatever, but like it's part of why I started building neuro, because I looked at everything else that was going on in the industry and is like, not only can it not solve the problem, it's wrong. Right. And the more that the industry continues to go in the direction that it's going, the more we're hurting people in the training process, without really producing any results on the back end. And so, it's not about, again, like what I said before, it's not about what the stimulus is around the student. That's totally irrelevant. What the question is what are we doing to produce the neural circuitry? Right. And is the neural circuitry going to produce the performance that we want? Right. So we've had the assumption for a long time, and the rest of the industry is largely focused on this, is how do I make the threat stimulus more realistic? Right. Well, when people are trying to, I mean, I know you know this firsthand, when people are trying to kill you, it's a fairly traumatic thing. Right. So the more that we make those things hyper realistic, the more that we take the risk of actually creating trauma during the training session, right?
Because it's too stressful.
Yeah, like our most common response to stress is resilience. Our response to trauma is injury, right? And it's not the experience. It's not any individual stimulus that causes trauma. It's the person's response to it, right? So trauma in a, again, 30,000 foot view scientific definition, right, is a non-plastic or a non-changeable brain circuit that gets formed very rapidly, like almost instantaneously, that you can't fix after the fact. And that happens because as the levels of the different chemicals, right, that happen under stress, as those levels go to certain, really, really high levels of some of these stress chemicals. And again, I'm doing this 30,000 foot view. I'm not a neuroscientist, not claiming to be. But what happens is you get, effectively like a chemical burn is the way I think of it, right? It's not necessarily technically, and the biochemistry of what happens, but you basically get a chemical burn in parts of the brain that are normally short-term memory that stay there permanently. And so, and that's a defense mechanism, right? How many times should I have to stick my finger in a light socket or get almost eaten by a saber-toothed tiger before I realize that's a bad thing, right? I don't need to do that 5 times, 5 times a week for 3 weeks to be like, all right, I got that, right? I should do it once, never have to do it again. So we've got that survival mechanism baked in. But when we drive the stress levels to that point in the training process, we also take the chance that we're actually creating the neurological definition of trauma during the training process, and that doesn't help us on the back end, for a whole variety of reasons. So what we're doing is a totally different approach to it, and saying like, this doesn't actually build the brain circuitry that we want, right? If I want to be good at, for example, drawing and shooting a gun at somebody that's shooting at me, I don't need somebody who's shooting at me to do that. I just have to stimulate the brain circuitry, right, and then construct the brain circuit board that will enable this performance.
I may have asked the question poorly. When I meant stimulus, I guess I didn't mean like you just said, like I don't need to train someone to defend themselves with a gun. I don't need to get someone to like try to stab them or try to shoot them, but giving them an auditory cue and then expecting them to respond to the auditory cue. Now, sometimes the auditory cue may be the thing to respond to.
Right.
But, maybe the driving analogy is a good one. It's like when I teach someone to drive, or teach my kids to drive, it's not like I'm going to say, brake. Now, I may say that, obviously, if they need to brake, but you don't train the person to brake based off of hearing brake. You train this person to brake based off there's a thing in front of you approaching you very quickly that you need to stop that approach.
Right.
So that's what I meant by stimulus, is like the right sensory system picking up
Yes.
the information
Correct.
and then processing it in that circuit board and
Bingo.
then giving the output, the correct output.
Bingo. So as I broke that down, right, I said, what are the things that we need to do at a mechanical level, right? We have to do motion detection, right? Because we're rarely going to shoot at something that's not moving at all, right? It may happen, but rarely. Certainly not in a self-defense thing, right?
It helps people to justify sight-focused shooting, though, to say that we're only going to shoot at stationary targets. We can talk about that later, too.
Yeah, we can talk about that. So object recognition, motion detection, the application of context, right, and decision making. I mean, these are kind of like elemental brain processing components, right? And like the visual stuff in particular, there's things that start in the retina, go through all the circuitry that goes back to the back into the, kind of the beginning of the brain, like V1 and V2, and then into the occipital lobe and all the rest of the stuff I'm not qualified to talk about, right? But like those are those processing centers are the things that we want to hit, because if we always shoot, or if we always do our skills or we do our skills mostly in the absence of that kind of stimulus where we're not building that circuitry, then we actually disconnect the skills from that circuitry, which is kind of an interesting thing. So there's the process of building circuits, right? Like you'll have two, let's just say there's two neurons, right? One's here and one's here, and they're trying to communicate with each other, and all they have is like, spotty Bluetooth. You go back and forth, right? And so they don't have good connection. Well, that doesn't work real well. So if we need to talk to each other a lot, let's actually get some wires and connect them together, right? So they get wires and connect them together, but you're still picking up all kinds of other signals. And so now you wrap those wires up with insulation. Now you have really good comms. And the comms are much faster, right? And this is obviously super oversimplified. But now I've got this insulated circuit. How do I tell it to do something else? How do I get a signal into it, right, that it hasn't been using? Well, I can't because I've physically isolated it, which is what made it efficient. And that's a really, really, really simplified overview of kind of what the brain's process for constructing circuitry is. And so if we always do these things in isolation, right, the corollary of neurons that fire together wire together, right? The basis of heavy learning is neurons that fire apart wire apart. And it's because of the process of how the circuitry gets constructed, right? It insulates it and it isolates it, which makes it efficient, but it also insulates it and isolates it. And so if we build circuits that are insulated and isolated from the ability to do things like make decisions, right? We're kind of like, you can think of it like building a highway. You start out with just like a big grassy field. And I can't remember who came up with this. I stole it from a cop in New York who I think took it from like the Huberman Labs podcast or something. But
I remember this section of the book. And
Okay,
I love the analogy.
So you start out with like a grassy field, right? And you walk through the grassy field and you get a game trail eventually. And then you get more people doing it. Now there's a path. And then you put down some cobblestones. And then eventually you build a highway. And you've got, drainage ditches and sound rails and, sound guards and all that kind of stuff. But if you didn't put any off ramps, the only thing you can do is hit the gas and drive to the end of the highway, right? You don't have any options to go do anything else.
And the infrastructure required to add an on ramp to that compared to adding an additional path to the trail in its elementary stages is much different.
Is much different. And there's destructive processes required. Right. And so if you think about it from our traditional training model, which really only produces good results in high resource, high attrition settings, like that's the reality, right? The guys that have high resource and lose, 80, 90% of their candidates every year, they do produce, very elite level performance. And they also break a lot of people in the process. Right. And there's acknowledgement of that, right? Yeah. This guy's like, maybe not good. We're breaking so many people in the process, right? So the kind of the basic model is we're going to build these skills and then we're going to go into the scenario based setting and we're just going to keep doing this until we, basically break through the drainage dishes, build some bridges, right? Break down the sound barriers and build the off ramps that we need or on ramps, right? And all these other connections. And that works, right? But it's high resource and it's high attrition. And basically, unless you're a full-time SWAT team or you're somewhere in the special forces world, you don't have the resources to do it. Nobody does. Most people never get to the point where they actually have the skills, right? That's kind of a whole nother.
That's why SOCOM has such a massive budget. Part of that is because of the amount of training, the workups, and the pipelines and stuff that they have to go through.
Yeah, and it's and good on them, right? But it's a tremendous amount of resources. So the 99% of the rest of the people that carry guns for a living are still, struggling to load and unload them. Literally.
Yeah.
I've, literally struggling to load and unload them.
Yeah.
Right. And that we really shouldn't be there, right?
These devices reset your trigger after each shot so that you can dry fire just like you live fire in semi-auto. Plus, the Blackbeard fires a laser out of the bore so that you can track your shots and work on height over bore offset for close engagements. And the Blackbeard X uses an accelerometer to track and analyze the motion of your gun on their Mantis X app. Even the United States Marine Corps saw the training value in the Blackbeard X and began to utilize these devices in basic training. So now Marine Corps marksmanship coaches can analyze recruit shooting performance using the Blackbeard in order to make them better shooters. So stop wasting time with traditional dry fire, order yourself a Blackbeard or Blackbeard X today and start training to a higher standard.
So let's talk about, I know we talked about there were certain obstacles, right? From logistics to admin to HR, whatever. If you were going to develop a program
Yep.
and you had your druthers, what would it look like? How can you paint that picture to the viewer of like what is the ideal based around this research and based around
Yep.
what we know about the brain?
Yeah. So what I do in the training design process, I start out with a very detailed, and this would be very similar to what anybody's, done if you've done this kind of thing in the military, or you've done real like formal curriculum development where it's been like structured and organized, and people that were trained curriculum developers were doing it. Very similar, like start out with a task analysis, like what is it we want people to do? It's amazing that gets skipped often, right? People are like, oh, like I went to a shooting school. This is really cool. Let's do this. And it's like, well,
Why?
is this, yeah, like why?
Start
like,
with why.
Is this even relevant to what we want people to do for the job, right? Oftentimes, that'll get you yelled at, right? And I was like, oh, stop asking those questions.
Don't ask why.
Don't ask why. Don't ask. Yeah. Why ask why? Try blood dry, right? Yeah, so that's where I start, and what makes what I do different than anything, at least that I've seen anybody else do, including the military side, is I don't just lay out the task. I lay it out in a, and this isn't necessarily different, but I lay it out in a detect to engage sequence because everything I'm doing is kind of on the combatives realm. Mm-hmm. Like, what does this look like from I get up in the morning? What skills do I need there? Like, managing the weapon system, kind of the administrative stuff. And then what does that look like in the process of detection to engagement? And what are all the branches I can go into, and all the other skills that we need? And it's not just what the skills layout looks like. It's what are the neurological functions involved in this, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, I wouldn't lay it out and say we're drawing the gun, right? I'd say I have to see something. I have to apply context. I have to make a decision, right? And that's all laid out in the process of drawing the gun. And so as you're going back and doing the training design, if you are putting together a drill, you're putting together a training, you're like, well, there's no visual stimulus and there's no decision making, then you're not actually doing the skill, mm-hmm. right? Because you're not using the parts of the circuit board that you need to actually do this for real. So even though you may be holding the gun and going through the mechanics of presenting it, right? Like most of what the brain has to do is not involved. So what you're doing is not relevant. So you wouldn't be able to use that drill mm-hmm. or whatever, or use that. If you just use that process, you're not actually teaching the skill. You're mm-hmm. teaching a different skill, even though the physical components of it may look similar. So I laid out that way, and then it actually is anybody that does software development. It'll look very similar to how you would lay out like a big software project. When it's done, it's like right now I do it in Excel because I've been building their own money build software tool to do it. But you end up with this, hundreds and hundreds of cells, with this stuff all laid out, or thousands, in a bigger program. And then you just go about the process of saying, okay, where do we want to start, based on logistics and resources and the program that we're trying to teach. And you incorporate what are the limitations of the short-term memory system and what is the process for me to get this from out of the student's brain into their short-term memory system, in a declarative, and then into the procedural system, right? And there's specific things you have to do to make that happen, mm-hmm. right? And then once it's in the procedural system, how do we link it with the other stuff that it needs to get linked to, so that we're building, operationally relevant performance through the training process. So to kind of answer that, my perfect world, right? Like we would lay out like, here's what we want the whole skill set to look like. And then we would, start out at the beginning, and your entry level classes, like the first couple of days, like people won't even recognize them necessarily as classes. So I helped, or at least if they look at the curriculum, they'll be like, oh, what is this? So for example, I helped the state of New York redo their police firearms, or not the firearms instructor, but the police firearms curriculum for recruits in 2021, 2022. We had some limitations going in that none of us were happy with, but it's just logistics are real, right? Like there's the perfect world that you do in like the laboratory. Then there's like, here's what we can accomplish. But we use this general process to construct the curriculum. And so the first lesson is basically teaching the police recruits to lock the slide back on the pistol, right? And that's basically the lesson, right? How do you pick it up without pointing at anybody, and how do you lock the slide back? It's 75 minutes long. Mm-hmm. So you are probably hearing that to the listener, and you're like, come on, like this is a total waste of time. And that was what the, kind of the cops were like, when they looked at it, they're like, this seems ridiculous. And I'm like, just trust me. Mm-hmm. Okay. Like this is stuff you're normally not doing at all. I've spent a lot of time teaching brand new shooters.
I like where you're
But
going with this.
I'm very confident in this side because I have taught this lesson to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people as it's, basically as it's laid out here. So the first guys that ran it came back, were like, we actually almost ran it. Like we ran out of time and people were struggling. Like, yeah, you ran out of time and people were struggling. And in a normal program, you may have had them live fire drawing from the holster already.
Yep.
People that after 75 minutes can't lock the slide back on the weapon. Right. And they're going to come back, by the way, in 2 days when you do this again, and they won't be able to lock slide back at all. And you're going to have to start over.
Yep. But
because
everyone wants to jump to that next step. They want to skip the basics. They don't want to obtain that brilliance in the basics and go to the next thing and next thing and next thing. Or be it because
basic shooters, basic shooters want intermediate training, intermediate shooters want advanced training, advanced shooters work on the basics.
Well, I'm actually currently building an online basic rifle, basic carbine. I haven't decided the name yet, but I was doing just kind of some research, like some market, what's out there, and looking at some of the programs. I'm not going to name any names or companies, but almost all of, if not, I think all of them are like an intermediate or an advanced level. Like there's hardly any fundamentals of marksmanship. There's hardly any like, let's talk about every single control surface on this gun and talk about why and how it interacts, when you would use it.
Yep.
And it's just, they jump right into, all right, we're going to do up drills. Hold on. Like, this person doesn't even know how to do sight alignment.
I'll tell you a story about that. I won't name the agency, but this was last year. I got asked to go do an audit of a fairly large law enforcement agency's firearms program for recruits. So I wasn't able to make it the first week, so I show up on the second week. And the first day was kind of a throwaway because it was like, they're statutorily required to teach the shotgun. Like legally, they have to teach it even though they don't issue it. So it's kind of like, all right, we have to do this, but like you're never going to get this. But
yeah.
So anyway, so it was kind of one of those. So it was, whatever. But good use of time, right?
Exactly.
Very good
taxpayer
use of time.
money.
Exactly, taxpayer money. But anyway, so I'm watching because they did a little bit of transition stuff. Like, okay, put the shotgun down, draw your pistol, and I'm like. There was one guy who was a PFI at his previous agency before he came to that agency, and like basically everybody else had like a visible at distance gap between the webbing of their hand and the backstrap or the beaver tail. And I'm like, so I grabbed the lead instructor and I'm like, nobody here is going to effectively manage recoil. It's not possible, right? Like it's not possible. They're going to have excessive muzzle flip because they're not gripping the gun properly. And you're no longer in a position to fix that because you finished handgun. They all qualified on the handgun already. But like this entire class is basically toasted, right? Like, I mean, they passed your qual, but they're never going to be good shooters unless they go do it on their own.
Wow. Like
you ruined them, right? Anyway, so point with the up drills, the next 4 days are rifles, right? So they started out. Right. And it was kind of, and to be fair, like if people haven't worked with larger agencies, like I know you probably like a lot of them are like, you kind of got like 2 instructors will be primaries. And then everybody else is like adjuncts that'll fill in that come from like different places all over. And so you end up with a wide variety of buffoonery going on, like and not everybody's on the same page. And that's really difficult for the students. And that is very difficult to manage because you got people you've never met before. You haven't seen in like 3 years are showing up. They're an instructor. They're saying something totally different than this other dude. Both of them are talking to the same student. Yeah. And they're just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Just stop yelling at me. Yeah. It's a mess. It's so bad for learning. But anyway, so at some point, right, like about halfway through the morning of the first day of rifle, one of the instructors has all the students on the line. He has them doing up drills. Again, like most of them can't load and unload the weapon yet, right? And so I grab the lead again. I pull him over to the side, and I'm like, I want you to look up and down the line right now. You got 2 guys that were combat arms in the military, and you got the one guy that was a PFI. Your other X number of people, which is a fairly substantial, large, not a single one of them is even in a position to either touch the trigger or touch the safety selector. Like they're literally practicing presenting the weapon to fire it in a position where they couldn't fire it. And they're doing rep after rep after rep after rep. And he's just like, oh, I'm like, you did it again, man. Like you guys are doing it again. You're teaching them to like, you haven't even taught them how to hold the gun.
We're on square 10.
Yeah. Like you haven't
square 1 through 9.
haven't taught them how to hold the gun. And he's like, oh. Anyway, so that turned into like this. All right, we got to back this whole thing back down. So they stopped and like taught them how to hold the gun. And I was like, that. I mean, that really should be like the first thing, And
even just pick up the gun,
right,
like just
that's where we said.
Yeah.
That's actually the first thing we start with in the art curriculum is pick it up. How to pick it up and not point at anybody. This is not tactical. How do you pick it up safely and not point at anybody and carry it around? But yeah, anyway, so they, and this, not that this qual means anything other than it's just kind of an anecdotal thing, right? But they fired like half or a third the number of rounds they normally fire during rifle week because they had to go back and like they spent all this time dry firing because everybody was so hosed up, right? Once they were actually looking at not just having them launch rounds and looking at the targets, but looking at what they're doing, right? And like trying to fix that. And then they finally got to doing some live fire, had them shoot, and they shot the highest qual score. And again, like I would not say like this qual means anything because it doesn't, but nonetheless, that class shot the highest qual score that any group of people shooting that has ever gotten at that agency.
It is a metric on some level.
It is a metric at some level. And again, like not that it means anything, but like every agency I go to that does patrol rifles, so they have a significant number of people that come back from in-service and they can't load or unload the weapon every time. Right. And I'm like, these people run around the country, cops with, M4s who are supposed to run into your kid's school to save somebody and they don't know how to load it.
Right.
Like that's not helping anybody.
They've practiced holdover for a couple hours and never practice it again. So now their height over bore with their mechanical offset is
right.
They don't know what that is.
No clue.
Yeah. It's the state of police training, it's abysmal. But you've thought about this more than I have, but like, how do you solve that given all the other things that are going on administratively, politically, logistically? Like what's because if I'm understanding, let's go back to the ideal thing first before we go into that. Let's go back to the ideal. So like, if you're going to build this course out, what does that look like at a student arrives Monday morning or whatever? Let's say like a basic handgun course.
So if we're looking at the professional side, like the saying like we're going to go do a basic handgun course, that wouldn't be my ideal layout because I can't give you a day of handgun. It'd be a waste. What am I going to do with you for a day? The only thing you can learn is to lock the slide back, and you'll fail to learn it. So what am I going to do in a day of handgun training? So in my ideal, my ideal structure, and we do have the resources to do this, right? And this is something that I try to point out is it's not that we necessarily need more resources to produce much better outcomes. We just need to restructure use of the resources that we have, right? So right now we have about, and this is not a scientific metric, right? But we basically have like 10% efficiency on our training. So if 90% of what we're doing is
Sounds
just
like an overestimation.
It might be, right? But like most of what we're doing has no impact on the student, right? At all. And certainly nothing that's long-term. And so what is the point of that resource expenditure if it's not going to produce long-term learning? There's no point in it. So you don't necessarily need more time. You don't necessarily need more ammunition. I mean, depending on the agency, right? But you don't necessarily need more overall time. You just need to restructure what you do, right? So if I've got 40 hours of firearms packed into 5 days, right, there's very minimal value out of that. If I have 40 hours of firearms packed into 40 days.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. That's a totally different ball of wax.
I thought that's where you were going to go with it.
Yeah. And so,
yeah, because it's so, everything's so sequestered. It's like, we got our firearms week. Now we have our defensive tactics week.
Correct. And those are correct. And those are assumptions. And some of that has like real logistical issues with it. So for example, or real logistical reasons, right? So for example, that was one of the limitations with the New York curriculum, right? They went from 1 week to 2 weeks. And so like the overall, like big overall, this is like, 30,000 foot big handfuls. These numbers aren't, surgical. But we went from 40 hours to 80 hours. Of that 40 hours or of the 80 hours, only 40 of it involves touching firearms. And of the 40 hours touching firearms, only 20 of it's live fire. And the round count stayed about the same, even though we doubled it, right? Wow. And so there's a lot of other stuff in there, right? Because it's not just the gun handling, right? There's, subject assessment, decision making, mobility, like all of that other stuff that you really need to do to be effective at doing the gun thing for real, right? Not just am I passing a qualification or whatever. So and there's a lot of dry fire that's mixed in with that. It's in, at least as designed, it is mixed in with the live fire. Like the designed and implemented is always a little bit different, but as designed, it's mixed in with the live fire. So yeah, so in the ideal world, you're coming in on that first day, right, and you're getting the beginning components of several different subjects, and then maybe some stuff, again, if there's a selection component of it, maybe you're getting beaten up a little bit and something that has nothing to do with the operational thing, right? Like we're going to go, hopefully PT without hurting you or whatever, or just put you like in a padded room and scream at you and see if you can handle it, right? Like whatever.
So like a police academy context, it would be like show up, whatever, orientation, 1 hour orientation, go to the range for an hour, learn how to lock the slide at the rear. Next hour.
Well, so what you brought up there is actually a really good point, right? So one of the reasons that we are so locked into this idea that says, "Hey, I have to go do this for a week," right? Is because we make the assumption that we have to be in a high resource environment to train with these skills. And sometimes we do have to be there, right? But if we can do something without the high resource environment, we should at least consider that and look at it, right? So I was talking to a military unit who I might still be doing some work on the training design side with. We're still kind of trying to figure out the logistics. But we were talking about some of this, and I'm like, when you get to some of these more complex skills, particularly when you start adding kit and all this, like, you don't have to teach the whole skill at the same time. So if I'm trying to teach somebody to reload an M4, and there's a complex component of just getting your other magazine out of your kit, you can teach getting the other magazine out of the kit. That doesn't have to happen on the range. You need the magazine in the load bearing vest or whatever. You don't need ammo. You don't even necessarily need a rifle. And so that doesn't have to happen in a live fire environment. You don't need all of the resources. I need firearms instructors, I need ammunition, I need medics, I need safety, I need, smoot pots, like whatever, like I don't necessarily need all the rest of that stuff. And so that's also where it's very helpful to kind of like surgically break down the elements of training and then have this very, very deliberate design process so you can look at the components of a lesson or of an individual's, section of delivery and say, what is it I'm accomplishing here? And what resource levels do I actually need to do that? And if it says, I don't need to be on a range to do this, or I don't need live fire, and I'm not saying that you don't do it on the range, because that may be, if that's where you're at, that may be logistically more feasible.
But don't tie yourself to that.
Don't tie yourself to that, right? Don't tie yourself.
I'm glad you said that.
Don't tie yourself to resource limitations that are completely artificial.
Because then you create false obstacles.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is, right? Like we build ourselves all these obstacles that we can't get over, and a lot of them aren't real, right? Like,
so in the example I brought, it could be, we're going to do orientation, welcome to the course. Next thing is we have blue guns out on the table. We're going to teach you how to pick it up for the next hour. We're going to teach you how to pick it up with your right hand. We're going to teach you, if it's not oriented the right way, how you orient it the right way and pick it up.
Right.
We're going to teach you how to pick up with your other hand. We're going to teach you, that's what we're going to do today.
And that right there is probably enough, right?
Yeah.
And then you come back the next day, right? Because the way this works in the process of going from I've got nothing in the brain to I'm in procedural memory, right? Like one of the things that's very, very difficult, particularly in group training environments, is getting everybody to have the same experience, right? Because you're a cop, right? So like if you talk to 10 people and you interview 10 people about the same thing and they tell you all the same thing, the only thing is everybody just lied to you, right? Because everybody's got a little different perspective about what they're looking at, because we don't actually see what's in front of us, right? We see we kind of walk around in our own constructed simulation of what's going on around us from a whole bunch of different sources, some of which we generate ourselves, produce consciousness, or what we perceive as conscious experience. And so everybody's receiving a different experience, right? So as an instructor, if you've got 40 people in your class, there's what you say, there's what you think you said. Those are definitely two different things, right? All the time. And then each individual person is going to hear something different than what you said, which is going to be yet again different than what they remember. So there's, what did I say, 40 people? So there's 84 versions of what happened. Right, or 82, right? There's 82 versions of what happened in that class. So how do I get consistent results if there's 82 versions of what happened?
Right.
That's very, very difficult. And so part of why that happens is that our brains have kind of a filter, right? Like we've got we're constantly getting bombarded by stimulus, and if we processed all of it, we'd melt down. Right? It's like everybody listening to this, can you feel your toes in your socks? You can now, but you couldn't before I said that because it wasn't a relevant stimulus to you, so you weren't processing it.
And the people that can, that is a mental, it's like people, I think people like Asperger's or something, they have like that stimulus over. I don't know if that's the exact,
There are definitely
right,
people
but
that
that's an example
don't
of like
filter that stuff
if we
out.
were in that state, we would just be, we couldn't cope with.
We
Or it'd
could.
be difficult
It's
to cope.
very difficult,
to
right?
cope.
People
Yeah.
that have those
Yeah.
issues have very
And they have to go
difficult
through
time
counseling
coping.
to be able to manage the amount of stimulus their brain is just constantly being bombarded with, and so
Right.
your brain has a filter to cut off, to cap,
Right.
almost like a mic or something. It like
Yeah, it's got like
stops
a
it.
it's got like a gain
gain,
bandwidth,
yeah.
right? It just cuts most of it out, and a lot of that has to do with our experiences too, right? Like so, if you're like tactical guy or whatever, like you walk into the mall, you look at somebody and you're like, all right, like doesn't look like he's carrying a weapon, his hands are really soft, probably can't punch. Yeah, definitely can't punch. Like, okay, that guy's not a problem, right? Well, you could be in there with your wife or girlfriend who's like, man, the shoes really match the belt. That's awesome, right? Like you're looking at the same person where it's like, did you see the belt and the shoes? And you're like, what?
Yeah.
Like, the two people looking at the same thing and there's no, like, just based on your filters that you've constructed over your life are getting totally different things, right? Like, and so the information you're even consciously receiving is different. And so that's the first challenge as an instructor, if you're teaching in this group environment, is there's what you're putting out and there's what the students are receiving. And that's two different things, right? And it's two different things individually for each individual student.
So
And so to mitigate that, right, the process that we use is called priming.
Okay.
And there's a wide variety of definitions of priming, and none of them are wrong. The way I use priming is a full teaching session with no expectation of retention, right? Zero expectation of retention. And so I stumbled onto this not because I did a bunch of research, but because I was teaching people, right? And I was teaching them in this format that I didn't want of, I can only get the sailors for an hour, right? So this is way back in the ship, right? So I got the sailors for an hour, taught them to load and unload the Beretta with dummy rounds, right? It was like the first hour-long lesson. That's it. It was just loading and unloading with dummy rounds. So we got through that, sent them away. I got the same guys back 2 days later. I got this big schedule. I'm trying to track where everybody's at in the process. Get the same guys back 2-3 days later. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just review real quick, and then we'll go on to the next lesson. And they couldn't do it, right? Most of them couldn't load and unload the gun. And I'm just like, I'm a failure. This is a disaster. I don't know how we're going to get from point A to point B, right? Like, and I'm obviously, I'm a terrible instructor.
How did this fall apart? We just went over, like, what is happening here?
Right. Well, and so what's happening there is you're working in the short-term memory space, right? You get information, you can work with it, but it's never really getting through that filter, and it's never getting stabilized, so it doesn't get consolidated. And so you're never really getting information to where it is stabilized in the short-term memory space. And so so for me, priming is doing a full lesson, a full teaching, explain, demonstrate, imitate, extensive practice, and zero expectation any of them will retain anything, because most of them probably won't. You come back and you need a minimum of a 24-hour break, right? Because there's brain processes that kind of like cleanse the palate and all of that stuff. Minimum of a 24-hour break, ideally 24 to 48. You don't want it to be like, if it's like a 3-week break, you're not getting any benefit, right? Or minimal benefit. So bring them back 24, 48 hours later and reteach it from scratch as if they've never seen it before, which you'll probably have to do because half of them will act like they've never seen it before, right? And then come back 24 to 48 hours later, and all of a sudden it's like, not only can they do it, but they actually look competent. And I'm like, well, and I started seeing that pattern of, I would teach it the first time, they'd come back 24 to 48 hours later, totally useless, right? So I'd have to reteach it again from scratch. Come back 24 to 48 hours later, and now they actually look semi-competent at it, right? They can do it. They look competent. It's not that things are perfect, right? But there's a little tweaks here and there, but they can actually do it. And then you're working on the enhancement. So the general process there would be, and these are 24 to 48 hour breaks in between, would be prime. And again, in my lexicon or language or whatever that is, teaching, like a full teaching session with no expectation of anybody learning anything. They come back again, and then you teach the exact same lesson, but now you expect they're going to learn something and they're going to retain it. After that, you're going to work on focused enhancement, where you're just kind of working on that individual specific skill. And then depending on the complexity of the skill, if you're kind of like pretty good at it at that point, now you start working on interleaved enhancement, or this is where you're starting to do the connections, right? This is where I'm connecting it to the rest of the circuit board that it needs to operate with in the real world.
That's interesting. Yeah, I feel like I've inadvertently done that before with students. So like for a course I've taught or for students I've coached, I've sent them my YouTube videos of like whatever
Right.
we're going to talk about. I'm like, hey, just please watch. Be it safe, a lot of it's safety, but
Right.
or fundamentals of marksmanship. I'm like, please watch this before. You don't have to, but I
Right.
think it will help make the teaching or coaching session or course more fruitful.
Right.
And they've watched it, and it seems to be the case that the people who watch it have a much better experience and are much quicker to pick on
Yeah.
than the people who don't. I don't have enough people to create some data from that, but
Right.
but that is interesting. Now, so let's say you have to teach based on earlier with the Excel
Right.
thing, you have like 80 things you need to teach. Does that mean you essentially have now 160 training days because each time you have to prime it the day before, or do you just how do you balance
No, so I'll mix it. Like, so the first day, the only thing you can do is prime, right?
Okay.
So then you come back the second day, you're going to teach what you primed before, and you're going to prime something
Gotcha.
new.
Okay.
Is basically how that would work. And it's actually kind of cool the way this works when you start looking at a skill set. And we mentioned this earlier, right? You're like, everybody wants to do the halo jumping, and nobody wants to learn how to lock the slide back kind of stuff.
Underwater basketball.
Yeah, exactly. Like space shuttle door gunnery. Let's just go start right there. So everybody wants to do the advanced stuff, not realizing the advanced stuff is just doing the basics, right? But you can actually do the basics. And so there's two things that happen as you go through this training process. And if you're looking here on the video, right, not listening to this just audibly, right, you'll see as it start, right, it looks like your training progression is very, very slow, and then you see almost a logarithmic, right, increase in skill set at a certain point, and there's like a breakover point. And it's actually kind of cool to see this as you do the design process. You can actually see it in the data of like kind of your assumption on where stuff is, right? And you see the skill set skyrocket. And there's two reasons for that. So the first is, even though it's not incorporated into the training model as designed, because it's just too complex and wouldn't actually help. Not everything always has to go through the process of jumping through, like, I got to get through the filter, right? And then I got to sit here for a while, and then I have to go there. Like, we do have the capacity to go work directly in long-term memory, right? So if we're using terminology people aren't familiar with, right? And there's no like framework.
I think that's a big one. Yeah, terminology is a big one.
There's no framework. There's no shelving. There's nothing for them to put the information on, and so it becomes very, very difficult for them to learn. Whereas if we're going to sit here and talk about like everybody likes gear, right? So if we're talking about red dots, which I know really nothing about, but if we're going to sit here and talk about red dots, people are going to be like, oh, I know all this, and I've got my Holosun and my Trigicon and my, whatever the other flavor of the week is, right?
But then you take a brand new gun owner and you're like, rack the slide. They're like, rack the slide? Like,
right.
Put it on a rack? Like, what do you mean, rack the slide? It's like, you have to, in that I've noticed, like, especially with brand new shooters, like that is such a challenge, and like being able to, like, okay, back it down a little bit, explain this in a way that is more colloquial for the general public, and not only the very small percentage of people that are involved in this, 2A community.
Right. Well, yeah. And some of that becomes, there's a big focus on that in a lot of instructor circles, and it, depending on how you like the environment that you teach in, if you work in an environment where you're able to space stuff out, that stuff becomes less important, right? Because people are learning through the process of doing, right? And the kind of observational learning and stuff. So like that, a lot of that, I think, becomes less important as you start putting processes that are based around learning, not around presentation. Because a lot of our stuff is based around presentation, right? And the student, all of the burden for learning is on the student. None of it's on the training process. So, yeah, I 100% agree with you. I'm just saying like, as you break away from the traditional training model, I'm going to try to give you everything in 2 days, right? And you're able to start saying like, well, we're going to design the training process based on the learning process, right? Versus like, we're going to ignore the learning process and design the training process around perception of resource limitation, or resource limitation perceived or real, right? Because sometimes it is real.
So, okay, let's talk about a lot of this
Yeah.
has been in the. Actually, finish what you were going to say, and then I'm going to have a question that relates to the civilian
I
training
just go
side.
just go into just go into the question.
Okay, so we've been talking about law enforcement, military. They do have
Right.
significantly more resources. They typically have these people that are either a captured or captive audience, however you want to look at it.
For better or for worse, they have people that are captive audience, and they have people who are a captive presenter audience. For better or for worse, yeah.
For a certain amount of time, and they have more flexibility, albeit there is logistics and bureaucracy
Right.
that may have to be managed to adapt the models that you have.
Right.
But in like a civilian training context, where it's like basic pistol 1 day course, or maybe a 2-day course.
Right.
How is it even possible to do that? And
Oh, it's 100% possible. The challenge is the civilian market is market driven, right? So it's not about whether or not. I mean, everybody in the civilian market has the capability. You know, if you're like, this is my top priority, I want to get really good at it. You have the capability to set aside an hour and a half per day and go work on it, right? Or an hour and a half every other day and go work on it. But people won't do that. And they won't do it largely because there's not a perception of value, I think. So that's what we tried to do with that SEAL mindset business, and what they finally came up with, that at least my understanding is it's still a commercially viable thing at this point, was basically a martial arts model where they had sort of like different, belt levels or whatever that they would work through. So like at that first level, you're not really doing a whole lot of shooting. I think it was, I don't remember. I wasn't. I was gone by the time they kind of like restructured the curriculum on this martial arts thing. But, you're starting out learning to load and unload the gun. It's like hitting 8.5 by 11 with like 2 rounds at 5 yards or something. I mean, something ridiculous, right? But most of it's focused on like the safety and the individual gun handling stuff. Most people are obviously progressing through that pretty quickly. So you're showing up, you get your initial belt, and then you can advance to the next belt. And so it wasn't necessarily perfectly structured from a, this, then this, then this, then this, but you're staying sort of in this little wheelhouse, right? So your ability to go past the progressive skill development is very limited. And so that's actually an important, we kind of skipped that earlier, right? Like one of the things that's very, very challenging for teaching these skills in particular is the progressive nature of them. So, and what I mean by progressive has nothing to do with politics. It's just like, if you're going to draw the gun from the holster, that's pretty complex, right? There's a lot of things going on there. And so if you're drawing the gun from the holster before you know how to hold the gun, manage the trigger, do whatever it is, sighting mechanisms you're doing and all of that, you're still doing all that stuff. You're just doing it wrong when you draw.
Yeah.
Right. Because you can't draw the gun without holding the gun. So if you don't know how to hold the gun and you draw the gun, you're definitely holding the gun because it's in your hand now. Right. But if you're doing it in a way that's not optimal, you're practicing holding the gun in a way that's not optimal. And so a lot of people don't quite get that, and they don't understand the mechanisms that are required in order to learn these things. And to be fair, like most people they don't even have a framework. They don't have a framework to understand what quote unquote works means. And that's something else that I find really interesting. We don't really have and that I'm hoping we can at least take a big leap forward with neuro, is being able to put some metrics on works. If someone's, like concealed carry community in particular, right? Like people are like, oh, like this works for me. Does it though? What does that mean?
It's like my truth.
No, that's exactly like,
This is my truth.
like this works for me. Like I have a 25 ACP in this little holster that's under my wallet in my front pocket that doesn't have a round in the chamber. And that works for me. Because you didn't realize you had it on all day yesterday and you didn't shoot yourself. Like if that's your standard of performance, then it does work for you, right? But like, does work for you mean like, I had to fight a guy with an AK in the food court? Like they're probably not going to work for you then,
Right. You
But
fight with someone on the ground. Yeah, it's like that. If that's the standard, it's like, well,
right.
good luck.
And so like what does quote unquote works mean, right? And that's something that
That's such a good topic to bring up too, because it's one of those things where I think is overlooked, and it's like almost like ethereal. Like it's like people don't even really think about it. It's like this theoretical thing of like they don't think about the details of what a fight actually is.
Yeah.
And so they think that, well, I have this thing, check. It's just like the department's like, oh, they qualled, check. I have this gun in my glove box. Check. It's like, okay, what
I
about
feel-
the details?
Well, and I mean, to be fair, a lot of us do that. You know, I mean, we all do it in
Yeah, it's
different
shortcut.
areas.
You have to shortcut
Well,
to some extent.
Well, and we all do it in different areas, right? Like, whereas like, I always say, like, what is the problem you actually want to solve, right? Are you saying like, I can no longer psychologically ignore the fact because like my neighbor's house got broken into or whatever, right? Like that there's a risk, and I can't just be like, well, it won't happen to me anymore, right? I'm not able to make that psychological leap. So what we're really looking for a lot of times is like not that we're trying to solve the problem. We just want to be able to get that psychological component back under control, right? So if I go buy a gun, don't even have any ammo, or go buy a gun box of ammo, stick it under the bed, hey, I'm safe now. Well, you brought something as dangerous into your house. It's highly unlikely you're safer, right? Like just by doing that, the gun is not a safe thing, right? It doesn't make you safe, right? If you know how to use it, there are things you can do with it that will help you be safer in some instances. But the gun itself is
It's not
dangerous.
a lucky rabbit foot.
No, it's not a lucky rabbit foot. It's not a fuzzy pillow, right? Like it's
We had a situation. I was gonna make a video about this. Happened yesterday. I think it was yesterday. Yeah, because we stayed at my wife's parents' house for the night, and they had gone to church, and we were packing up the kids' stuff in the truck, about to leave,
Right.
and we typically would bring our car to their house, and so we had the truck, and I guess the neighbor didn't recognize the truck, so he came over. I'm not gonna say his name, but he came over to the house while we were packing up, and like rang the doorbell, and my daughters were like, "Oh, it's such and such. Can we go answer?" I was like, "Sure," because I knew who he was.
Right.
And when they answered, he was like, "Oh, okay. I was just making sure it was you guys, and I didn't know if they were being robbed." And I was like, "Oh my gosh!" So that my daughters came back in there, and I said, "So what did he say?" I heard him, but I said, "What did he say?" They said, "Oh, he was just making sure it was us, and they weren't being robbed." And I was like, "Let's pause and think about this for a second. What if they were being robbed? What was his plan?"
right.
And my oldest daughter, she was like, "Yeah, I thought about that too, because he didn't have a gun or anything on him." So I'm like, "What would you have done if this was someone robbing their house?" But so many people, I don't know. It feels like it's a convergence of like this, and this is kind of off topic, but a convergence of this like Good Samaritan with like a normalcy bias, and then like a failure to perceive like second, third, and fourth order consequences, and
Right.
like all those converge into people getting themselves in bad situations. Granted, most of the time nothing happens,
Right.
but when it does, it's like, what was your plan exactly?
Right.
If they were being robbed, just go, oh, okay, well now let me call the police. And I try to tell people, like, I'm surprised how often, not to go on an additional tangent, but I'm
Right.
surprised how often people are willing to call the police when they don't need them and not willing to call them when they need them. Like we had one time where I almost got dispatched to a call where a lady's kid threw his ball into the neighbor's yard, and they wanted me to come get it, or like the cable went out or something like that.
Right.
But then these situations, like I know people that would not call the police if they thought someone broke into their house,
Right.
and like their door was kicked in. And they were like, "Oh, well, let me just go see what happened." It's like, really? Police don't clear out a house by themselves, well,
No.
barring certain circumstances
Right.
if they don't have the manpower. But you're gonna go do it with no body armor, no backup, no radio. Like, what are you thinking?
Right.
So, anyways, yeah. So going back to the details of like, yeah, it's like, oh, this thing happened. Let me get this lucky rabbit's foot, and now I'm good.
And now I'm good, right? And we see that all the time. I mean, so like I remember, you know, working overseas. It was just one of the cities that our group worked in. A helicopter got shot down, right? Which it's war, right? That happens. So everybody started freaking out, right? I mean, it's not like this couldn't have happened on any given day, right? It wasn't our helicopter, right? Like on any given day, a helicopter can get shot down. And, but all of a sudden it was like real because a helicopter actually got shot down, and they're like, oh, well, let's start putting security guys on the resupply helicopter. And it's like, I mean, I don't really care. I'm happy to sit on the helicopter. Like, but what exactly do you think the security guys are going to do on the helicopter? It's just going to be two more bodies. Like, that's all that's going on here. Right. Like,
Wow.
but nonetheless, right. They're able to go, okay, I've addressed that issue. I've addressed the issue. I've got security guys on the helicopter now. And we do that all the time. And all of us do that with different areas of our lives. Right. Like, and it's kind of like, what's the consequence and how important is it kind of thing. Right. But yeah, kind of back to what works, right. That's something that I think is, at least to some degree, very unique with firearm stuff, because you bring in a brand new shooter, and if you like, there's a wide variety of tasks you're asking them to do, right? Like, because the reality is, if you want to have a functional skill set that will enable you to solve the real world problems we could all run into, even as a concealed carry person, it ranges from entanglement to 15, 20-yard surgical shooting, right? All under combat conditions, right? Even for in today's day and age, even for the concealed carry person, if you're looking at kind of the full spectrum of things you might want to address, I mean, that's a lot of different skills, a lot of different skills. And so you can't take somebody who's brand new, because the tool itself can hurt them, right? If not, and kill them, right? Like, frankly. So you can't take someone who's brand new and be like, all right, I want you to do, these 10, 20, like whatever different tasks at a level that will actually produce an outcome in a fight, because you can't put them in a real fight. And you can't ask them, be like, okay, we're going to do, I want you to do, headshots at 15 yards the first day you have the gun. Like there's no mechanism to do that, or whatever. Right. And so you don't have any ability to give them a window into what works looks like. Right. And a lot of people, even that are teaching, don't have a window into that. Right. Because it's like, what does works look like? I don't know. Like, whoa, I read the Uniform Crime Report and it says most gunfights happen at 3 yards, and so therefore we're at 3 yards, and you're on the silhouette at 3 yards, therefore what you're doing works. It's like, when's the last time anybody got in a fight with a static piece of paper at 3 yards? Is that really what we're doing here?
Yeah.
Like, can we back this up a little bit? Number one. Number two is, we realize the Uniform Crime Reports is fights that we lost, right? Like, for the most part, do we particularly want to, like, let's replicate what untrained people do in fights that we lost. Let's design our training based on that. Is that the best plan, maybe?
Wow. Yeah.
But so that I think is something that is it's somewhat unique, and it really impacts the learning process and how we teach these skills, because there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of assumptions that are kind of made on some of like the test tube learning research, right? That's kind of getting promulgated around right now. That doesn't necessarily translate that well into application, because we don't, you're not going to build the subcomponents of skills that way, right? So there's like a whole theory of training, and this really kind of goes back to, like, Sykes and Fairbairn, and then Applegate, World War II, which 100% good on those guys, right? It's like, hey, we had a very limited amount of resources to, send people out to do a dangerous job, right? What's the best that we can do for them with this limited resource set? So, if anybody's not, but most people haven't, right? Everybody likes to talk about Sykes Fairbairn, but most people have not actually read Shooting to Live. That entire training program was 36 rounds.
Wow.
1 day of training in 36 rounds. Right. So if anybody's like, that's what we really should be replicating, because those guys were awesome. I don't disagree with the statement. They were awesome. Is anybody at that resource level today? Right. Like, we have 1 day and you're going to get 36 rounds. That's it. That's your whole training program. Every year you get 36 rounds. Gosh. Right. And that's your entry level training program, 36 rounds. And then, we'll do it again every year, maybe. Like, and then, if you read the end of the book, there's actually, they were still having
I haven't read the book.
Still having a lot of people get killed in fights too, which, I mean, was very close range fights in the, alleys in Shanghai, right?
It is interesting though, like how these educational institutional models get stood up and the motivation behind them, right? Like,
right.
Be it because we need this system to get people going across,
right.
across the ocean, versus it's kind of like the public school system. Like that was set up in a way.
I think that puts us down a whole different rabbit hole. That's a whole different rabbit hole. No,
but it's there's initial motivations for why it was set up the way it is, and it's like you kind of lose the forest for the trees, and it's like, let's look back and why are we doing this the way we're doing it?
Exactly. So right. So if you think about those guys, right, you've got 2 guys training thousands of police, and again, this is like turn of the century, right? Like in China, these thousands of guys who are just, getting killed in large numbers, right? With their traditional, bullseye training. And you have to understand what that was too, right? That was the traditional, one-handed marksmanship, like bullseye style competition stuff. Well, that has no relevance to combat. Nobody would make that argument. It's like, okay, we're going to put together a 1-day program and shoot 36 rounds, right? Head out, gunfighters. I mean, but that's what the program was, right? And that's the resource limitation was there. Nobody today is dealing with that resource limitation. Nobody is, right? Think about the OSS in World War II, right? It's like, okay, this is kind of abstract. I don't have like specific numbers, but it's like, okay, school teacher, in 2 weeks, we're kicking you out of a plane over France. Like, so between jump school and tradecraft and comms, we're going to do some combatives and firearms in here too, right? Like
Wow.
nobody's at that resource level today, right? We maybe could be there again, but we're not now. And so
why continue those educational
so,
models?
Right. So are those educational models necessarily the best, right? Like if you want to make the argument for that, fine, but like don't say like, well, this is what they did then and it worked. So well, what did work look like? Right?
Wow. Yeah.
And is that still really what we want to do or not? If you want to make the argument, fine, but let's not just say like we should use that because those guys are legends.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and not saying that they shouldn't be, for what they did or whatever. In any way, I'm just saying like let's actually look at, what neural circuitry are we building in our 1-day 36 round program?
Yeah. The firearms training community though seems to have a struggle with that, where you have these heroes that in their own regard, they are heroes.
I'm not going to argue with that
either
at
ahead
all.
of their time or whatever the case may be. They like you said, they were working with the resources that they had,
right,
the knowledge that they had at that point, and they were able to put together something that, look, for all intents and purposes, it worked. Like we were going back to, it worked.
Well, it did work.
And it's like, maybe could there have been a better way? Maybe, but why put them on a pedestal perpetually,
right?
And
never
reevaluate.
And say we can't change this, right? Because
never think critically about
right. And I look at it this way, right? I'm like, those guys that were ahead of their time and changed things, like we look at them now, right? And the industry looks at them and goes like, oh, these guys are legends because they changed stuff and made it better. Okay, well, let's follow in their footsteps and change stuff and make it better, right? Like I don't believe in like changing things just to change things, right? Or like I'm not a big like I'm going to take the same thing and like come up with fancy terminology and then say I'm doing something different. Church was like, yeah, we've all heard that kind of thing, right? Yeah. Like there's somebody out there now that's doing a lot of that, and it's a very good shooter, right? But it's like, and it's like, like no, everybody's been teaching that same thing for like the last 20 years, and it's really not. It's great for competition, not so much good for gunfighting, but like what you actually like, no, dude, what are you talking about? I don't even understand the terminology you're using.
Well, even stuff like, and this is, people hate when I bring this up, but we'll talk about Cooper safety rules. All guns are always loaded.
No, they're not.
No, they're not. They're not. And I did a video on this, and I actually prefer the NRAs. I tweaked them a little bit, but always keep the gun. I say oriented, not point, because oriented is more of an intentional task, whereas pointing, like people think of pointing as an intention, like I'm pointing at you. They don't think of me doing this as pointing, but I orient it is with respect to what the gun's perspective is. It doesn't matter what you were intentionally. So that's why I say always keep the gun oriented in the safest direction. Always keep your finger high and off the trigger until you're ready to fire. Always keep the gun unloaded until you're ready to use it. Which again, there's different states of loadedness, condition 1, whatever. But just to tell people all guns are always loaded, first of all, that's not a rule. It's just a general statement. So if you were to tell someone who doesn't know what a gun does, that didn't mean anything to them.
Well, and it's not true.
Yeah, it's not true. And there's no directive element to it. So, the Marine Corps tried to say, well, treat all guns as if they were loaded. Well, you don't even do that because we do dry fire. And so there's so many elements of that it's just like, but when you bring that up to certain people, it's like, how dare you offend Cooper safety rules? It's like, look, he was, again, ahead of his time. He did amazing things, but why not reevaluate this stuff and see maybe if there's a better way? I'm not saying I found the better way, but let's see if we can look for one at least.
Right. Yeah, I'm not a fan of Cooper safety rules. Anybody that's read any of my books knows that.
Well, I want to go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So you got the neuro. Let's talk about what it is, what it does, and we kind of talked about the motivations for it. So kind of explain how that accomplishes that. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the objective with this was looking at sort of that convergence of what we need from a training standpoint, from a logistical standpoint, what we need from a learning standpoint. Right. Again, we're talking about what do we need to construct that combat relevant circuit board in the training process, particularly with firearms and firearms related tactical skills. And then what are those components that we need to put on the circuit board, right? Because that's the other part of it. If I don't know what components I need, that's a problem. So it kind of that elemental level, right, was object recognition, motion detection, the application of context, mobility, right, all kind of those things, the actual physical skills that are involved. And then on the training and learning side, I need something that's affordable. I need something that's scalable. I need something that gives me wide flexibility in what I do. A one-trick pony doesn't help. It's like I got this one thing that does this one drill. Well, it's not worth paying money for, right, at that point. So basically what we did is we strapped 3 laser pointers on a shot timer and then put a computer and a control system and a couple of different like wireless networking tools in it. For it's got both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and then so what this enables us to do without going way down into the weeds is rather than using predefinitions for range control, we use visual stimulus for range control. So if you think about everything that we've traditionally done on the range, even from the perspective of like I'm just going to teach you to shoot. Right, I'm asking you to apply the fundamentals of marksmanship in such a way that allow you to hit something, right? But in order to control what you do, I always tell you how many rounds to fire. And so as soon as I do that, there is no actual reason for you to maintain any situational awareness because you don't need it. And so what we do is we build shooting skills that don't have situational awareness, that don't have any connectivity to decision making, and that don't have an ongoing visual processing component related to the environment. Because
it's the car earlier that you mentioned with no steering wheel,
right? And so once I go
straight,
correct,
well,
and it's like so the gun gets in my hand, and think about like people on the professional side. We always try to get people to pass the qualifications, and what have we always told them? Ignore everything. Just look at your front sight, right? Relax, like the world melt away. Just like front sight, press the trigger. So you're telling people once they get a gun in their hand, like they're not allowed to think because if they do anything other than what you just told them, they're going to get yelled at, right? You're not allowed to think. Stop thinking and don't see anything, right? That's not a recipe for successful tactical outcomes, particularly on body camera, right? Because the reality is that situations are dynamic, right? They continue to change and evolve around us. So even assuming that I made a good decision to get my gun out, that doesn't mean that a second and a half or 2 seconds later, once the gun's actually out, that same circumstance exists. And if it's changed and I don't have the ability to get off that highway, I'm still sending rounds, right? If I'm like, hey, I'm gonna execute this skill sequence of a build drill or whatever, right? Well, you're sending 6 rounds at that point, whether or not those 6 rounds are justified. Maybe they were justified 2 seconds ago, but they may not be when the first round goes off.
Yeah.
And so, and it's not, it's obviously not just about that. But so the 2 things that we're doing, right? Vision-based range control. So it enables us to give you visual stimulus, not just to initiate the shooting process, but that is used to control the shooting process, right? And that's a very important distinction. So a lot of people are like, oh, we have visual stimulus because we have turning targets or whatever. Well, but you're not having to continue to evaluate it during the shooting process. And that's what we have to do for real. And so that not only enables you to like mix in other skills because you can have different visual stimuli mean different things. Now I have to, change what I'm doing and do something else. It also, on the both on the instructor side and the student side, it requires you to use visual skills that allow you to keep seeing what's happening around you. Right. And so that's something that's been, and I know, it's so difficult to teach because I've never been able to give you tasks that require it before. Right. And so I'm very big on as we're designing and like working on training environments and not necessarily range design, but like, how do we do range layout and how do we, set up, I don't really call them targets anymore. How do we set up the subjects, right? Because they all behave and like based on behaviors, based on what you're going to do. Like as we're setting these things up, if I give you a task where you don't have to do things correctly to accomplish the task, and doing things correctly is harder than doing things incorrectly, then why would you do them correctly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we do a lot of that. We have done so much of that in the firearms world for so long, where we're looking not at the circuitry construction, we're looking at sort of an artificially imposed idea of like, well, this would be good enough in a fight, and therefore it's the standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or therefore this is acceptable. So, for example, I'm going to be at 2 yards and expect you to put it somewhere in the torso because that would probably help solve the problem in a fight. Well, okay, but I don't have to actually do anything in terms of like shooting mechanics to make that happen, right? And again, that goes back to actually the Applegate Fairbairn thing, right? Like they weren't teaching shooting mechanics. They were using existing gross motor skills and putting like, here's how to make the gun work in the middle of existing gross motor skills. And that works, but it fails very quickly, right? Outside of very specific circumstances. Like, it's not that it doesn't work, right? It's just that it's very limited in the times that it's going to work.
I think this might be my engineering training. Like, sometimes it helps to think of the extremes of the problem, the boundary conditions.
Absolutely.
And so, like, if tomorrow someone told me, look, the Russians are going to invade, the Chinese are going to invade, you need to put a rifle in everyone's hands, what would you do? Put a rifle in everyone's hands and teach them the what I could teach them in 24 hours, which is not. Well, let's take it more extreme. An hour from now, put a rifle in everyone's hands. If you could even do that, let's assume you could.
Right.
But then what would you teach them? Like,
how to get rounds in and how to make it go bang.
Exactly.
That's it.
And then that's it. And
figure it out from there.
Is that robust enough to be to account for every context? Absolutely not. Is it good enough given what we have, the time constraints we have, the resources? Probably, if you put enough guns in enough hands.
It's good enough to lay a base of fire, right?
Yeah, you run that that model out across time, and
right. Yeah, I mean the Russians lost a lot of people at Stalingrad, but they had a very simple training program. What was it, every third person gets a rifle, everyone gets 5 rounds?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
pick one up.
Yeah. So to hopefully help illustrate to people like what he's talking about here, and that like you may have something that works under whatever contrived parameters you have structured.
Correct.
But what if you could do it better? And help me just to make sure I understand this from a execution standpoint with this. You would do like one per line. If I say you have like 15 officers, each officer would have one behind them. And that way, unlike typically with turners, they turn together because it's like some sort of hydraulic system. They all turn together. And so even in that context where it's like, okay, you're only shooting when you see the target, and let's even throw in a no-shoot target in that. Well, everyone is shooting together.
I want to come back to that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas with this, I would assume that you could be like, you're the only one not shooting. So now we're training you to think, oh, well, just because people are shooting next to me doesn't mean I have to shoot.
Correct. Because everybody may get different stimulus.
Exactly.
And because we've got, so one of the things we did on this is one of the things that has been made it so difficult when you get outside of the individual, like onesie twosie environment, and you get into group training, it is very, very difficult to get people into that performance shooting window where they're actually developing real skills, because in order to do that, you have to have feedback. A key component of learning is feedback. Like, you have to understand what you did, what the outcome of what you did was, and then as you make micro adjustments to what you do, how does that change the outcome, right? Mm-hmm. That's a key component of learning to do any skill. And so traditionally, all you know is whether or not you got the rounds off in time, right? Mm-hmm. And if you have turning targets, you didn't even know what you hit, right? So the learning value is effectively zero, mm-hmm. right, when you're using turning targets on a range. And so one of the things I wanted to do is make that performance shooting data available to everybody. So we have like, throw this stuff on the ground.
It's rugged too.
It's rugged. Yeah. So we basically have a wrist worn sensor that works like an individualized shot timer. So everybody will get their, you'll get your response times and shot splits, like all that performance shooting data we're used to getting. You're able to get that with each individual person having that available to them with every repetition. And so we can now give people a window into the mechanics that go into their structure and their recoil management, right? So it's not just, I expect you to hit this and I expect you to get this number of rounds off in this amount of time. I expect your shot splits to look like this, right? Mm-hmm. Because that gives us a window into what does our trigger management look like, and what does our recoil management and our structure look like, right? Because those are kind of the tells of well, I got the gun bouncing around, so I can't get it back down in time, and my shot splits are slow, right? Or I'm not hitting. And so,
And is that measuring that? Is that also the wrist strap, or is it just measuring the auditory and like an accelerometer to pick up recoil? Like, what is it?
yeah, so it's not working like a Mantis X. It's not giving
that's
you
what my
that
next
kind of
question was gonna
stuff.
be.
It's
Yeah.
just giving
Okay.
you your splits.
Okay,
right?
okay. But that's so that each person knows their
Each
splits,
person-
and it's not like the whole line, and you trust the instructor to know that he heard the last shot go off before the timer went off or something like that.
Right. And the point of this is not even so much about, that for like the quals or whatever. It's about like, after you did this, go back and look at what happened, right? Anybody that's gotten moderately good at this has done it on their own with a shot timer, right? To this point, right? And there's limitations to that because you're working on the audible stimulus, but at least you can see your performance shooting. And we've never been able to do that in a group training environment before, and it really, really hampers our ability not only to teach people, but it hampers your ability to learn when you don't know what just happened. How do I get better at it if I don't even know what happened? Right. So for me to be able to look at every individual repetition and be like, well, if I'm doing this correctly, my split should be, I'm just making this number up, my split should be 0.3 seconds to be able to hit. Well, my splits are 0.75 seconds. So why is that? And now I can start working on making that better. Right. Versus like, well, nobody yelled at me, so I'm good. All set.
That's so cool. I'm just thinking about like you have everyone online at the 7-yard line, and everyone's
Getting
there's
something
no
different.
threat. All of a sudden, he's getting a threat. No one else does, or maybe 3 people do, and no one else does. So I'm assuming the instructor just like push a button, and you can set up the parameters like randomly or however you want to do it.
Yeah, so there's kind of a wide variety of ways this can be employed, which is like once people kind of understand what Neuro does, one of the biggest challenges to implementation has been people want to try to do everything that it can do, right? And so they end up they're just like it's like the Chinese menu of options, which is how we built it, right? I didn't want to build something that was a one-trick pony. This is, at a fundamental level, it's a sensory stimulation and performance measurement tool. Right. And it's enabled for, designed around tactical applications, although there's other uses for it, but that's what we built it for is like, well, I want to give you the relevant sensory stimulation. There's a buzzer on it too, or I want to give you audible and visual stimulation. I want to stimulate object recognition, which we can do with, you probably won't be able to see these on the video because I didn't bring the bigger projection lenses, but we have the ability to do, that was a pistol. We have the ability to do, shape projections, and these lenses are optimized for 10 meters, which is why they're just looking like a dot at this range. But and then if you make them blink, it stimulates the motion detection circuitry, right? Like the brain's motion detection circuitry starting in the retina and then going back to the occipital lobe, right? So you're getting all of that relevant circuitry stimulation, right, and all of those processing centers involved. And so it enables us to, like I said, like the two things that we're able to do with it at a really high level, we get rid of the predefined skill sequence. So even though I can measure exactly what you did and I can hold you to a standard, I can do that without telling you what you're doing ahead of time. Right. So it fundamentally changes what we can do from a concept of qualification. Right. So imagine like you step up, you have an array of subjects in front of you. You don't know if you're shooting. If you do shoot, you don't know how many rounds you're firing or which ones you'd be shooting at, and everybody may do something completely different, but everybody's held to the same empirical standards. Right. And so it requires you to use visual skills that are combat relevant, because if as soon as my gun gets in front of my face, I can't see what's going on around me, I can't accomplish the task because the task requires me to keep seeing.
Yeah.
Right. And to use the information that I'm getting to drive my performance, right, or to drive my behavior as the shooter. And so those are things we haven't really ever been able to do before. We've got ways that, that people have tried to do it or tried to implement, like just a simple visual stimulus. Now you're responding visually instead of audibly, but that still doesn't get us there. Because it doesn't require us to use combat relevant visual skills, right? We've never really had a way to make people do that before. Traditionally, it's like you go learn the shooting skills and then you either figure that out in the house or you would try it, right? Rather than like, well, let's teach it to you up front, right? And now everybody can do it. And so these things also, I mean, obviously they're wirelessly networkable. So the ability to give people more to see, right? Like if we talk about the performance shooting side, there's always been this gap between like quote unquote tactical shooting and then the competitive like performance side, right? And some of that is like tactical people who can't shoot very well. They're like, well, no, that doesn't matter because like I'm tactical. That's why That's
Yeah.
why I can't hit anything on the range, because I'm tactical.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, every gunfight where you don't need to hit what you're shooting at, sign up for that one.
Yeah.
But there are legitimately, right? You get into like some of the stuff in competition. It's like, come on, man, like this means nothing.
There's certain game
It's
aspect, yeah.
It's dancing.
And
That's what
is,
it is.
yeah.
It's dancing, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with dancing. There's nothing wrong with gun dancing, right? But it's gun dancing. It's not. It has some of the stuff's relevant to fighting, but it's nonetheless gun dancing. And so being able to take and put metrics on stuff and then give people combat relevant tasks and continue to add combat relevant tasks to training. So there's a point, and I don't know exactly where these numbers are, but they're probably in the vicinity, like real world, going from a visual stimulus where you don't know what it's going to be or where it's coming from, like somewhere around like a 1.5 second presentation, somewhere around 0.3 second shot splits. Like I don't know these numbers for sure, right? So I don't, and then somewhere around like a half a second time to change what you're doing, right, and go do something else. At the point where what you're doing is not working or is not relevant anymore. Like, so somewhere in those time frames is probably where, not that we couldn't get better, but we're not adding anything tactically, right? We may even be removing tactical value if we get faster from there. So think about it, right? If you look at it from a combat arms standpoint, right? If you got a guy gets really, really good, gets his trigger tricked out, right, and he's shooting 0.15 second splits, right? And then you have a guy shooting 0.3 second splits. So what's the result of both of those guys if their first round is pretty much within the same time frame, right? This guy shoots twice as many rounds to put a dead body on the floor as this guy, right? So the guy that's twice as good a shooter has half the combat effectiveness because he can only kill half as many people with his loadout as the guy that shoots, 0.3 seconds.
And how much time did it get him to get to that skill level too?
And how much is he giving up to shoot that fast, right? In terms of situational awareness and stuff. So where I'm at, and again, I don't know these numbers for sure. And obviously what I just said is a little bit more focused on like combat arms, like we're fighting a large, nation state entity or whatever. But the general principles are still relevant, right? Like I think where we can go with this, and part of the objective of neuro is like, now that we can measure all this stuff and I can continue to add stimulus, because okay, now we can do this with one subject, and now you have two, now you have three, now you have four. Now we got multiple directions and we got cover, and obviously you start losing scalability as you add stuff, right? And you start adding directions. Now you need specific ranges, or you can't do a live fire or whatever. But as people get to the point where it's like, okay, you've now achieved a level of skill where being better at this will not make you better at fighting, right? Like you're going to shoot, we could make you shoot faster, but that won't make you a better fighter. So now let's make you continue to perform at that level while we add tasks that are combat relevant, right? Where now you have to see more, you have to see, and you have to make more decisions. You have to mix other skills in it. Now you have to do it while you're moving, and not just moving, but moving based on a decision, based on a dynamic environment around you. And while we do that, we're not going to do the traditional thing of like, okay, well, now that we've qualled, we're going to do shooting and moving. And you just got everybody running around blasting rounds into the hinterland and nobody's even checking the targets. No, we still expect you to have 1.5 second presentation, 0.3 second splits, and the standard of accuracy. It doesn't change now because you're moving or because you have to make decisions or because you have 6 or 7 skills that you have to mix together. Right? We still expect this performance standard. And so I want to come back, like, so two things, and they're kind of related, right? Like our entire framework has been so hosed up. And I didn't really even understand this until probably 6 months ago, as we kind of started getting neural working and really started running training with it. But like in 2 ways. So the first is, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, like we could do shoot, no shoot training like that. Just think about the mental schema that we are creating when it's a shoot or a no shoot, because that's not how the world works, particularly for law enforcement, right? You have a window of time where force can be applied, right? It's not like that's a shoot, I'm going to stop thinking and shoot it.
It's not
I'm
that
stop
binary.
Evaluating. It's not binary at all, right? In some combat arms applications, maybe, right? But even there, right? If your buddy's running across your muzzle, you probably want to stop shooting, and you probably want to see that before it happens, right? So yeah, like we like even the language that we use of shoot, don't shoot is a mental schema that's fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, and it's also horrible PR if you think about it.
Terrible.
Like,
what do you mean is shoot or don't shoot? It's a behaving.
What am I? You think I'm a shoot or a no shoot target? Am I a shoot or a no shoot target? And I mean, you could just take that so many different directions.
But and think about how we've always trained, because even when we do, and we even call it shoot, don't shoot training, right? I mean, this is a terminology because that's
Exactly,
how
yeah.
that's what we call it, right? So you think about like we have a target that turns, and that's what we've always done, right? You go in the shoot house and it's a shooter, it's a don't shoot. You look like, oh, there's a gun. I don't have to see anything else. Now I do my minimum standard response or whatever, right? Or I do a bill drill or two to the body one or whatever it is,
Exactly.
right? Whatever it is I'm supposed to do, my quick kill drills or whatever. So, and that's bad on a couple levels because as soon as I saw it, I stopped seeing anything and I just shot, and then I'll stop and look again, right? And I don't know if the shots were effective because it doesn't matter, right? Because it was a shoot, right? So I shot my 2 rounds and drive on. So for all kinds of reasons, right? It's just it's a fundamentally flawed mental schema. It's not like we don't know that, we just haven't had tools to do something else, right? And so that's one of the things we wanted to do with this is now everything is dynamic stimulus all the time, right? And like you have to keep seeing what's going on because that's what's telling you what you need to do as the shooter, and that's very much that's the mechanism, right? That's the combat relevant circuit board that we need to use. So that's the one comment I wanted to make. The other one was I lost it. There was something else I was going to say. I'm sure it was brilliant.
We'll probably think of it.
Yeah, I'll think of it.
Well, I was talking about the turning targets, the shoot and no shoot, how you can have different people engaging at different times. I don't know if maybe I can. Spark it.
There was some other point I was going to make. I should have written it. Should have written it down, but I kind of slipped out of the brain there. No, you're good.
So with this, you would have like a department. If you have like 15, a range of 15 lanes, you get 15 of those. I'm assuming you have like a controller or some interface for the instructor to use to be able to say what.
Yeah, so we built this to be like by design. It's a very, very scalable thing. Like one of the things that is very difficult for technology implementation, and not just at the agency level, but on the civilian side too, right? Because this is stuff that's relevant for everybody, right? If you care about defending yourself, defending your family, you want to make good decisions when you shoot, and I hope you do if you carry a gun. That requires you to be able to see and process information when you have a gun in your hand, and so. We wanted to build a tool that enabled solving that problem, right? And also that enabled solving the qualification problem. Not that that's a fix tomorrow thing, but I couldn't go after qualification the way I am and then build something that didn't solve the problem, right?
Sure.
And so it's a very, very scalable implementation. So if you buy one of these boxes, there's a lot you can do with it. And like I said, it's got a wireless communication suite in it. So you can put up to 5 of them together and you don't need any controller, right? You can do all the controlling and write your own custom programs and all the preloaded drills and everything just right on the box. You don't need anything else to do that. Again, like put up to 5 of them together. So, multiple directions, multiple dimensions, whatever. When you start getting into the, I want to do an external control, right? Like where I'm not controlling it direct or, putting programs directly on there. Right now it's through an iOS application. We'll eventually have an Android thing, although it'll probably be a ways out. People always ask why we did iOS first because Apple's such a pain to build with, which is 100% true. But we're really targeting, like coming out of the gate with it, really targeting agencies. And everybody knows how, well, if you've ever worked with the government agency, you know how their supply system works, which is like, you need to buy this. And they will buy the supply guy will buy the absolute cheapest thing and be like, well, here you go. Right. So if it's our, I don't want to be dealing with somebody else's hardware not effectively running our stuff because there's so many different Android devices. So with Apple, at least I know what the hardware is.
There's at least
And I know
standard.
that it's quality hardware, so we can at least work around the limitations there and put something out that works. So that's why we kind of went that way. But anyway, so yeah, so you can scale out to. We built this. We built the pipes, right? We designed and built the electronic pipes and everything on this, or the wireless networking concepts, to theoretically do 100 lanes of 10 devices per lane. Which is it's kind of that wouldn't happen, right? It's an extreme use case, but kind of all being centrally controlled. And there's different ways to control it. One of the things I like to do is pick what each individual, pick what we're going to do. So like say we're going to work on, we've kind of got some variations on par times that are like vision based and multiple skills and stuff. So for example, you get a stimulus telling you to draw. We're still measuring your draw performance right against the specific standard, so we can isolate that skill. But you don't know if you're shooting it or not. If you do shoot, you don't know how many rounds you're firing, right? And then as you kind of go from there, like I have I know I'm going to draw, so I'm going to work. I know I'm going to work on that. I don't know if I'm going to shoot, and I don't know which target I'm going to draw and shoot at, right? Because I have an array in front of me, right? And I have to So I have to keep this vision, and as I'm engaging this, I may or may not have another thing I have to shoot, right? So I have to see all this the whole time.
So you would have each target would have its own device?
Yeah, so each target or subject, as we call them now, right? Subject would need its own device. So in most implementations, what people are doing now, and it's just because of the traditional range infrastructure that we have, right? It's single target, single shooter, right? Or single subject, single shooter. So it'd be like 1 neuro per. You can scale that out. So theoretically, you could have 100 neuros per lane. I'm a big fan of doing that, but that's obviously not realistic. I sell them, so like I want everyone buy 100 neuros per lane and put them out there. Right? I'm a big fan of that. But no, like, so as you start getting into, again, like talking about like how do we make people see more, give them more to see. Give them a task that requires them to see more, right? And make them use visual skills that enable them to not only see enough to hit, but also see what's going on left and right? And start pushing that peripheral processing out. And, making those ongoing visual processing, situational awareness, and all that a part of the shooting skill at a synaptic level.
Wow. That's awesome. So does the watch or the wrist strap pair, like if you had like 3 set up, it'll pair with all of them?
No. So this is set up for an individual shooter. So you can link, like in the way that a neuro array would work, you'd have like 1 neuro, is the terminology we use is an array. So you'll have one, which will be the control device for that array, right? Which would be like for an individual shooter would be engaging on an array. Obviously there's other applications in a shoot house and stuff, but think about lane range. For an individual shoot, there'd be one array of 1 through theoretically 100 devices, right? But 3 to 5 would probably be the most the most realistic for, of what will be possible on most ranges or for most people. So you're going to have one of these. That's what the ISO will pair to. You can have up to 4 ISOs paired to one of these. So if you got like relays, people don't have to necessarily swap these out in order to make the relays work. And then, but yeah, so it's not like one of these is going to pair to 3 different devices. Only one device is getting the data.
Gotcha.
Right. The other ones would be providing projections, right? But all the data is going to a central.
That one's like, okay, I turn this one on. I'm receiving feedback that he's shooting. I'm turning that one off.
Correct. Like all that happens. Yeah. Like that's not necessarily how the back end of it happens, but yeah, like that's basically, and then all the data gets collected here. And if you're controlling it centrally from the iPad, then you can pull all that data back centrally and store it if you want to. Our stuff, and I know this is a big thing in the, like, not just for 2A, but also for cops, right? If it's recoverable, it's discoverable. And I mean, if you pull this data without the metadata, it doesn't mean anything. It's just blinking light patterns, basically. But yeah, so none of our stuff will save anything unless you make it save something, right? You can set it up to autosave and stuff, but that's all manually enabled. We're not. Yeah, everybody probably listening to this is familiar with the big tech abuse. I know I am, right? Like kicked off every platform at some point for, they wouldn't even tell me why, right? It wasn't content violation. Like, okay, well, whatever.
Yeah. And the reason that's important too with that, what you just said about the data is like when you're training, you're making mistakes.
And if you're not making mistakes, you're not training.
Exactly. But those mistakes could be manipulated, could be exploited by a savvy attorney and make a bunch of people that could not get out of jury duty convinced that you don't know what you're doing.
Exactly. Yep. 100%. So yeah, so that data, like where at least right now where it's super useful, right? You see it at the end of each run, hit the next one and it's gone, right? It's just in RAM and then it's out of there. But certainly in a long-term training program, right? Depending on the unit or on the individual level, right? There's certainly applications for that. And like right now, everything's just basically here on the iPad, iOS application. We'll be building some other tools, kind of as we go, for longer term, like, tracking trends and stuff like that.
And so this, I mean, how new is this product?
So we're basically just like the iOS app is still in beta. We just started selling them this year. I mean, technically we sold them last year, but everyone knew they were buying something that was like truly a beta thing. So yeah, I mean, it's just like we're basically just coming to market right now.
Wow. Yeah. I didn't realize that. I thought it'd been like a few years, but that's exciting.
Well, it's been in development for a
few
years,
of course, yeah.
But yeah, as far as like actually getting the market, we've got 2 police academies using it full time for range control, and then we're starting to like we've been really focusing on the agency side coming out of the gate because it gives me a much smaller attack surface for customer service, right? Particularly as we're getting the software bugs ground out and stuff like that. Yeah, we're starting to see, more and more interest as we do it, and people realize things like, yeah, I don't see anything when I shoot, right? And I probably should. We did I won't name the agency, of course, but we did a demo a couple months ago. And it was a couple of the chiefs it was a fairly large agency. A couple of chiefs from the agency were there. I did my little spiel about the brain science. I'm drawing neurons and axons and dendrites, and there was kind of glazing over like, well, we'd like to see some live fire stuff. I'm like, cool. So did it at the classroom on the range. We got onto the range, and they had 2 police recruits that had just finished pistol training there, right? So get them up there to be the guinea pigs, right? And so I gave them something very simple, right? It was just, if the red dot is there, you're going to shoot. If there's a green dot, it's a no shoot, right? That's it. Very simple. Just giving you as a marksmanship drill. There's no time, anything like that. So the one recruit started as a red dot. He came up to shoot it, changed to a green dot. He put 15 more rounds into it.
Nice.
Yeah. And then reloaded and was going to
Wow.
shoot again. The chief was like, "Ugh!" Chief's eyes were like that big. And I was like, so remember we talked about the mechanisms, right?
How shoot or no shoot.
Right. Well, remember we talked about these mechanisms, right? Like we build these highways, and there's no mechanism to do anything else. And we give people skills on purpose where we've given them tasks that don't require them to see anything when they shoot other than just watching the sights bounce. And that's, that's not great if you need additional information to keep making decisions.
The stimulus will change.
The stimulus will change at some point. And if
the only stimulus is my gun stopped shooting, well, that's the only stimulus you had to work around.
Right. Or I finished my string of fire because I knew what it was.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, like that's been how we've trained forever. And a lot of that's based on range limitations. And so, yeah, that's really, like I said, the high level overview, what Neural allows us to do is continual visual processing, because you don't know what you're going to do. I don't know how many rounds I'm firing. I have to keep seeing in order to figure that out. Right. But it doesn't remove the requirement for me to hit what I'm shooting at, or, have shot splits or response times and all that stuff, because all that data is available on every single run to every shooter. So it makes us use combat relevant visual skills, and because otherwise you can't do the drill, right?
Yeah.
Or you can't shoot effectively, and then enables vision-based range control.
So I think it's clear that that example is one where it's showing that, like, okay, there is a deficit here, and there's a problem with the training model. It's this whole what works thing. It's not successfully accomplishing that.
Right.
What have you guys used, or do you intend to use as a measure of whether or not that works? And I think it does. Intuitively, it seems that it does. But other than just evaluating gunfights, which I guess that's one way, but that's there's so many variables there. How can you evaluate whether or not that is?
So I think, like, one of the things that we're working on, starting to kind of collect some data now, right? And saying, like, well, how are people doing on their capacity to make decisions and de-escalate right at the beginning of training versus the end. I mean, I think where the rubber meets the road, though, it really is going to be, it's going to be a bit of a longer term, like, what does this look like on the street? Because there's no question that we can give somebody a new task, and then if they do it, for like 2 weeks, they're going to be better at it at the end, right? Like,
sure.
Like, I mean, that's not really a hard sell to anybody.
Regardless of what it is.
And I have, I keep running through marketing guys because I'm like, no, they're like, oh, you got to say stuff that's not true. Bye.
Yeah.
Right. From the marketing standpoint, there's a lot of pressure to kind of do that, right? It's like, oh, well, let's come up with some metrics and say we show 1,000% improvement on X, Y, or Z, right? And I guess at some point we're gonna have to. I got to figure out how to cross that bridge. But I mean, at the end of the day, it really is about how are we doing on producing the operational outcome and the operational performance. And to me, that looks like fewer gunfights and more hits than the gunfights that we have, right? And less officers getting killed. I think it's a combination of all those things, because I don't think I've never been a cop, so I stay out of the tactics thing because nobody wants to hear a non-cop talk about police tactics. But it seems like, some subset of OISs that are justified probably still shouldn't have happened, right? Or there would have been another solution to the problem, right, with some better use of tactics and stuff like that. And
do you think force on force is a metric, or it's so difficult with like how you
it's so difficult to measure that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, force on force is a fantastic tool for that, right? There's limitations on it. The limitations are not, I don't think fully understood. And a lot of the people that just push force on force, it's like it's not like force on force is new. Force on force has been going on for a while.
Even back to swords.
Right. Well, yeah, but even with gun, I mean, what Sims have been around since the early '80s or whatever, been around for a while. Everybody does it now. Rates of hits in police gunfights haven't gotten better, right? The metrics haven't changed. So I mean, there's definitely things that are important there, right? Good force on force training, I think, is essential. But it's not. It's certainly not the whole solution. You can't learn the mechanical skills of shooting in force on force, for a couple different reasons. So when you're using simulated weapons, you don't have the same recoil, right? So you can use shooting mechanics in force on force that won't work with the real gun and be very successful in force on force training, both because the recoil isn't there. And then also because you can see the rounds in flight and you can see the impacts. And so it allows you to walk your rounds in. And you're going to do that subconsciously. You're going to walk your rounds in because you have an objective and you can see, it's that error-based performance, correction. And you can't do that when you're shooting real people.
Yeah.
Right. Like that just doesn't work. So things that we can be very successful at in force on force don't give us a window necessarily into success for real. Now, if your stuff doesn't work in force on force, it won't work for real, right? But the opposite of that isn't necessarily true. And so that's kind of one thing. And then the other, another place people go with that is like simulation systems, right? I'm probably not making a lot of friends in the industry with this, but man, a lot of the simulators out there. I mean, think about what you're doing from a brain circuitry standpoint. Like I said, don't look at the simulation, look at what the student's doing, and did what the student physically did during the simulation, would that have solved the actual problem? Right. And if the answer to that's no, then it's bad training. Or at least if you're doing it as a tactical training setting. Right. So,
well, most of them just feel like a Disney ride.
Yeah.
Cause you're not even walking. And so you're going through this, there's several of these ones that people are probably aware of, the same ones you go through every time you do it. You go through the school, or the movie theater. And you're not even walking, so you're not actually orienting your body, your head like you normally would.
Well, think of it from a skill, even just a skill-based standpoint, right? So like responding to that kind of thing, right? A killer kind of threat in a public area. How much of the skills involved in responding to that involve that firearm? Almost none, right? Like. And not that the firearm's not important. That's kind of the terminal component of that. But most of the skills involved in that kind of response are mobility, communication, door procedures, right, searching, all that. And you don't have to do any of that in simulator. So like you're not doing any of the relevant stuff to solve that problem in the simulator.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you're not doing any of the relevant skills there.
Well, and then to top that off, the actual perspective, right? You don't have parallax of objects, which I don't know if that's the right word here, but objects that are near you versus the target behind you. You don't have to worry about holdover if you're using a rifle, because the screen is the distance at which it's going to take data. So if the target is 50 yards on the screen versus the target is 10 yards on the screen, that offset is going to be the same because it's hitting that.
Well, and that's I mean that depends on the simulator. Some of the really high end ones have.
Well, some can have.
Some of the really high end ones have really good math and stuff like that in the processing. But then this is another thing about simulators. Both like, and I know like the whole world's trying to go into VR right now. So if you get in, I'm in the weeds right now and doing some kind of like back in some of the newer research that we're working on. Like a lot of the actual brain processing centers that are used for like evaluating distance, right, and like the lower level processing stuff that is like the mechanics of skills is actually different brain circuitry in VR than it is in the real world. Really? And so while you can there is a lot of value that you can get out of VR, but you can't, at least from everything that I've seen in the all of the fundamental research, you can't learn the skills in VR. Because even if you learn skills in VR, the skills learned in VR will not translate from the real world, even though skills from the real world will translate into VR. And there's a growing body of research showing that, right? Everybody's like, oh, like VR, and this is so cool. Like, don't look at don't look at how cool the thing is or the system is. Like, what brain circuitry are we building, because that's what's going to produce the operational performance outcome is the brain circuitry. And if we're not building the same brain circuitry in the training environment, then we're not going to produce that outcome in the real world. And I'm not against virtual reality, but understand what it does and what it doesn't do. Like some people are saying, we can learn shooting in VR. Good luck. Good luck with that.
So I've actually wanted to test this. I wanted to test this. I have Ace VR, and I have wanted to take someone who, actually our neighbor, she's never shot at all.
Right.
I took her son Evan. We did like a whole video of it where they're from Canada.
Okay.
And never shot before. I taught him target focus shooting. I didn't even talk about sight focus shooting, and he did amazing. He 25 yards at and IDPA still targets. I'm sorry, IPSC targets, still plate rack, 100% accuracy. Like it was for me. It was. Yes, you can teach a brand new shooter target focus shooting if you teach it the right way and teach them eye conversions and like what happens with the doubling vision and stuff. But to say all that, I want to.
Well, and in fact, if you teach people that's just how they shoot, right? Versus like we're going to teach you this other thing and then expect you to
develop into this next thing.
Go develop into this next thing when we have spent the first basically formative development of your shooting skills, teaching you something is totally not relevant to the gunfight.
I'm glad you said that. I want to talk about that more too. But with the VR thing, I've actually wanted to take her, train with her on a VR system for a day,
right?
Maybe not a whole day, but and then go to the range, first shot. Obviously, understand the safety, the actual safety part, but first shot and just see what happens and see if I suspect, and I may be wrong, but I suspect she would do much better than someone who just comes out to the range and I train with them on the range with like dry fire and stuff, even the limited amount of time I have doing that versus a game environment where you have the flexibility to do it a lot longer, I guess maybe. And then I don't know. I'd like your thoughts on that. How you think something like that would do with like a brand new shooter and teaching them like, just bringing a gun into their sight line and understanding the vision and aligning things.
So everything that I'm seeing in the literature says that you're using different visual processing in VR than you do for real. So what I'm kind of in the early stages of this. I'm certainly not the world's expert on simulation technology by any means, right? But everything that I'm seeing is I'm kind of getting into the weeds on reading like all the whole study, right? I'm reading these studies is like mostly what is transferring in simulation stuff that's actually transferring to the real world is the non-synthetic component of the simulation. So for example, right, if I'd spent a lot of time practicing gripping an actual gun and managing the trigger on a even if it's not a real gun, right, but a SIRT pistol or whatever, right? Like that's not synthetic. That's a physical thing that I'm holding. And that's a physical trigger that I'm manipulating. So those things are translating. Whereas at the point where the visual skills become something where I'm processing distance, it doesn't work as well, right? And you're not getting that transfer. And the reason is because you're using like your brain's actually using different circuitry for that visual processing. So I find it interesting, like some of this stuff, people are pushing kind of this simulation technology. And it's like, oh, well, buy this, massively expensive system to effectively do what you could do dry fire with the stuff you already have. There's obviously there's some other things you can get scoring and stuff like that, on those. But, at the point where the visual processing becomes relevant seems to be where that stuff starts breaking down, at least with a lot of the, legacy systems, and obviously they keep getting better. So
what is like that? What are they saying? Like the distinction between those visual processing systems?
So it's not necessarily
at the risk of getting too much into the weeds.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
Well, so like at a high level, they're saying you're using different strategies. For example, like judging distance. Your brain uses different strategies to judge distance, and therefore it's using different circuitry to do that. Where it seems like, at least from the stuff I've reviewed so far, where it seems like becomes a lot more value with practicing skills in VR is when you also do extensive real world practicing of the skill.
Gotcha.
Right. So there's even some studies that show like, okay, we can tell that there's crossover in the circuitry because we go into VR and we get worse at the other thing, and we get worse at the real world stuff. So we know there's impact on the same circuitry.
Wow.
Or in some levels, it's like, well, that's maybe not the goal. And again, that's like the lower level
Yeah.
stuff. Like I don't want to be like, like hammering like VR has no value at all, because like it's like
Be a great time for my ad.
If you're interested in new innovative training tools, then you have to check out Ace VR. And make sure to use promo code DEFENDERS to get 1 month free. I'll admit that when I first heard about this device, I thought it was probably a gimmick and there was no way it would feel realistic. But the moment I put on the headset and held the controller, it was obvious to me that we had stepped into a new era of firearms training. Not only does the virtual reality environment accurately represent the real world, but the pistol controller has the same weight and feel of a real gun. And the trigger feels just like an actual trigger. With Ace VR, you can play several different game modes, from drills that work on the fundamentals of marksmanship to competitive stages, and even more entertaining modes that work on situational awareness. You can also compete with friends and others in the Ace community. And don't forget to use promo code DEFENDERS to get 1 month free.
there's definitely value in it when it comes to like some of like the strategy stuff, and there's mobility stuff. Like, I would never put somebody in a screen simulator, like not tactically, right? Because it's like I'm going to give you a tactical environment and give you all this terrain, and then tell you can't interface with it. So go participate in a tactical simulation, but a fundamental precondition is that you must be tactically unsound.
You take a knee and it doesn't change what you're looking at.
Right. Or like
this box in front of you is
or like,
still in the
hey,
same
there's a
position.
door. It would be really helpful for me to see what's over there, but even if I walk over here, I can't see that, so I just won't. Right. And so like it's like, go be tactically stupid in this tactical simulation.
I wonder if something like Apple's vision, because that's like augmented reality. And so now you're having a situation where you could have a shoot house. And again, you got to balance like, okay, well, why not just set up the targets in the first place? But let's say you want to have real looking people in the simulation, like rendered targets that look like a real person that respond, and like you go in and look around. You're actually in a physical building, but that it's augmented reality painting these targets over. I wonder if that's maybe anyways, just
well,
you could see that going somewhere maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I've got, like I said, this is all new stuff. I don't have all the answers to it. I've kind of we're working on pioneering a technique called, two of them, like pre-traumatic stress resilience is one, right? And then representative stimulus generated imaging is a component of that. So the objective of what we're doing is to build the brain circuitry. In order to build the brain circuitry of seeing an object, I don't need the object in front of me to see that, right? Or to see motion. And not everybody can do this, right? Some people have, which I think the technical term is aphasia, right? Where they don't have the ability to image stuff. But our brains are constantly imaging things, right? Some people hallucinate, right? They see things that aren't even there. That's obviously not what we're looking for. But we've had this huge focus in the industry for so long on, trying to use technology to create the most realistic threat stimulus possible. And it's all about how do I make the threat stimulus more realistic, right? But the flip side of that is that the threat stimulus the stimulus that we deal with in our world where people are trying to kill us is in and of itself capable of producing trauma, right? Experiencing that stimulus can be traumatic. So, and if I go into a training environment where I'm creating those elevated levels of stress chemicals, right? Kind of once they get to that tip over point, and I'm changing how the brain processing works, I no longer am capable of learning motor skills, right? Because I've basically eliminated the brain's ability to do the motor skill learning. Now the only thing I can do is effectively create traumatically formed association, right? So it's like the finger in a light switch. And so if I put you in a training environment on purpose where the only thing I'm doing is having you stick your finger in a light switch, right? Like, as an instructor, that's very difficult to control what that outcome is. And B, I'm now creating potentially unwanted operational results out of that I can't control as the instructor, right? And this gets a little dicey because you run training, right? And for some people, it's kind of like another day at the office. Like there's stress involved, but they're not running super high stress levels. So for them, they get to have an experience and they get to learn from it, right? Other people are running super high stress levels. And so they're just basically associating the, stress with the attempt to perform and potentially some stimulus in the environment. So the example that I use in class with this, and this is just abstract, right? So imagine you got somebody or you run a scenario in a trailer, right? And you have officers going to a trailer on a domestic call, and there's a guy sitting there on the couch with a newspaper, right? And they're like, "Hey, could you put the newspaper down?" He's like, "No, I'm reading the paper," right? And then the newspaper goes down, and he, shoots the officer 12 times or something with a sim gun. So, if there's no other pre-attack indicators, and the guy goes from like perfectly calm to just like drilling you with a gun, right? An experienced guy would be like, "Okay, man, like, thanks for the ambush scenario. Well done, right? Like, whatever. Can we, and you just kind of like block that out.
There's no win.
Yeah, there's no win here. You just set this up because you wanted this guy to shoot me. Like, thanks." But if you have somebody that doesn't have that additional context to kind of like, basically dump that scenario out and it's like, whatever. And they actually redline during that, right? Like, you can't control whether or not they are now connecting a newspaper with a gunfight, right? And so potentially now, right, particularly with the additional context of a trailer, that guy goes into a trailer as a guy on the couch with a newspaper and he redlines, right? And now those stress levels are spiking because of the newspaper.
He's like, I've seen this before.
I've seen this before. And that's the purpose of scenario-based training, right? Because you want that. You want that recognition prime decision-making, and I've experienced this before, and I know what the solution is, but the solution to a dude on the couch with the newspaper is probably not to draw down on him.
Yeah.
Right? But that guy's experience, because of that, the way that training was run, would say the correct answer here is to draw down, right, and go take cover, right? Which isn't necessarily going to produce the good outcome. And then when you get into the, like real bad trauma side, like now you have like a guy's now on the bus the next day. And again, these are abstract examples, right? The guy's on the bus the next day. He sees somebody with a newspaper, right? The newspaper now triggers him. He goes basically into sympathetic response because there's a newspaper trying to control that. And the guy also has a cell phone, right? So now the cell phone kind of gets sucked into this vortex is now associated with the newspaper, now also activates that, right? And that's where it gets into like, people with real problems that, but that's kind of that, like, it can become a vortex where it starts like pulling other stimulus into it, right? And so to the extent that we can build the circuitry, we can build the same combat relevant circuitry without creating the trauma, right? That would be potentially a better way to go. And so what we're trying to do, or a technique we're trying to pioneer and work on the foundational, like, underlying research for it right now is, if you can image that yourself, like if I can give you a low fidelity experience instead of the high fidelity experience, right? You're not going to sit there and be like, oh, I mean, you could do this right now, right? Like look over at the door and be like, there's somebody at the door, throwing a water balloon at me, and you could take action in response to that. And you can, at a very low fidelity version, you can image that. And so the underlying literature review says that when we image something, we're using the vast majority of the circuitry as if we were actually watching it. Right. So
I've heard that before, that like when you imagine something, your brain almost cannot tell the difference between, now you're consciously, you can,
right,
but there's a part of your brain that doesn't know. And that's why like, visualization is so important in sports.
Correct. Cause it's that exact same, I mean, it's those exact same mechanisms that we would use in sports. Like, I'm going to visualize this happening, right? And you're kind of running through and you're getting reps without the physical repetition. And so this will, at least in theory, right? And again, we're kind of on the foundational elements of this right now, right? Using very, very simple stimulus like, laser dots or triangles or whatever, which nobody's going to see a green triangle and have a sympathetic response to that, right? Or, whatever, right? A red laser dot or red hand or, whatever. Using very, very simple stimulus and then providing definitions to that, we can now get the same neurological processing functions as if you had a full-on projection, right? But do it without the risk of creating the trauma. And we can do it with higher repetition because I don't need all of the resources necessary to produce this high fidelity stimulus. So if the high fidelity stimulus creates trauma and takes a ton of resources and reduces the scalability to the point where I can't get repetition, does it actually add value, right? Or at least does it actually add value in the majority of training? Can we build all of that circuitry before we bring you to that point in the training process? And so anyway, I don't know if that made sense.
No,
I'm kind of like really wandering in the weeds here. But yeah, so that's some of the stuff that we're working on and saying like what we're doing, right, as far as the direction the entire or most of the industry has gone with, let's just try to make this stuff cooler and more realistic, and now you can like feel the blood spray on your face and smell the dead body.
We shock you when you get shot.
Right, exactly. It's like, well, and I'm not saying that there's not that there's not potential value at some points in the training process for that, but like we're not going to build motor skills that way. And at the point in the training process where we send people into sympathetic response, at least related to operational stimuli and doing real skills, they're really not capable. Like they're not neurologically capable of any learning, right? Of any long-term outcome from that other than the creation of trauma, right? And so, like I said, our it's not like we want stress-free training environments, right? A stress-free training environment is like, hey, go take a nap, bro. Like that's stress-free training environment. Like our response to stress is typically resilience, but our response to trauma is injury, right? So at the point, like, and I have, this is not proved, right? But I kind of have a running theory, and everybody I talk to who's been around for a while and done a lot of like real world stuff is kind of like, yeah, like we're potentially doing a lot of at least setting the stage for, or if not screwing people up in the training process. And if we can get, the first on contact combat performance without that, that would be a better way to go for sure.
Well, something, I can't remember what chapter it was from in the book, but you talked about, it was almost like trauma resilience and how people that were more well trained on fundamentals and mechanics were more resilient after a situation.
Yeah, so like in the first book in Building Shooters, there's a section there where I talk about there's a symbiotic relationship is one of the really interesting things out of the lit that I had no idea until I got into the diving into the neuroscience literature. There's a symbiotic relationship between procedural memory development and resilience, right? And even between the stress response. Right. So, in a real world example of this, right? So if you're a very good shooter, right, you know what you're doing, you can get your gun out of the holster really quickly. Right. And so you're walking up to a traffic stop that could potentially go bad. Right. And you're like, that looks odd. Right. Your hand goes up to your gun, you disengage retention. Does the fact that your hand hits the gun make you more stressed or less stressed? Right. If you're very good with the gun, it's like, okay, I have a tool and I can solve the problem with the tool. Right. And so your stress level goes down a little bit because you're halfway to solving the problem. Right. If there is a problem, I'm halfway to solving it. On the flip side of that, you're the guy that like barfs every morning. Right. You can't eat before a qual day because you hate the gun so much and you're so bad at it. Right. Now your hand hits the gun. Does your stress level go up or down? Right. So your stress level at that point is going up. So like two different people are having two totally different responses to that same thing of like even just touching the tool.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. And so that's sending us potentially opposite directions on how that whole situation is going to go, or even can I continue to process information and make decisions, right? Just based on that level of procedural memory development. Right here, it's like, okay, well, I've got all these skills and I'm good to go. Here, it's like, I'm in meltdown just over the idea that I might have to use it.
The feeling of your grip alone makes you stressed out.
Right, it makes me stressed out.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of one level. The other, and this is also relatively new. It's actually very new stuff. So we're working on a kind of a training, like what are our different models of training produce from a stress resilience standpoint. And so there is, I wouldn't say it's established scientific fact, right? But there's, what is established is that there's a very negative correlation between, a large volume, like we're talking about volume of neural circuitry, right? They're looking at like what's the volume of the gray matter right between these areas. So between amygdala, like the amygdala based memory, which is emotional memory, right? And so like that's kind of what happens when you have a traumatic memory, right? It basically normally your short term memory runs to the amygdala, and then over time it'll get transferred over to long term memory, which runs to the hippocampus. This is any neuroscientist out there. This is obviously your cognitive psychologist is very.
I've watched Inside Out, so I feel
you're good to go, right? So this is obviously very high level overview of this model, right? Kind of greatly simplified, but it helps to understand it, right? So if you think about our, and all of us have been in this situation, right, where something happens, right? You got very emotional about it, and you just can't really process it in context. And like a week later, you're like, okay, maybe that wasn't that big a deal, because you're now thinking about it related to all these other things, and that's because the brain. Like initially you have this experience, right? We're probably not going to remember anything without emotional context. We have really, really strong emotional context will remember it, and then it gets moved over to long-term memory, and it kind of gets absorbed with the rest of your relevant experiences. And okay, now you can look at it in perspective. Well, if something happens in a traumatic state, the brain doesn't need to move it, or it doesn't move it over into that context, and it just stays running through the amygdala, right? So you think about, and all of us probably have this at some point with an experience, and certainly know people, where you're just like, bro, you need to get some context on this, whatever it is, right? A relationship or a breakup or whatever. It's like, well, part of the reason that we have a very difficult time doing that is because when it's something where and again, this is based on the chemical composition of the brain tissue at the time the memory is formed and immediately after, right? So if it becomes basically a permanent memory trace running through the amygdala, the brain doesn't move it over to the hippocampus. And so you actually can't process it in context because it does not in the part of the brain that has contextual processing, right? So you're basically just stuck kind of in this like emotional processing center, and then re-experiencing anything related to that can basically reactivate that emotional state. And so when we have experiences that are, basically your skill set, right, or your physical skill performance runs to the amygdala, and there's a high volume of that circuitry that negatively correlates with stress resilience. So people that have that are not very stress resilient, right? And it's like, okay, you're going to have a really hard time coping with stress, even though you, like, in an evaluative standpoint, we may look at somebody and be like, man, that guy's he's going to be a good operator, right? Or he's going to be good because he sees a threat stimulus and he goes and annihilates it, right? Or he does really good with the skills, but he's not going to perform very well in the long term, probably because the way that was built is through emotional memory, and it doesn't, like, that negatively correlates with stress resilience. If we create that memory where we'd have the same, it wouldn't be exactly the same memories because that works a little differently, but like, you have that processing through the hippocampus instead, that very strongly correlates with stress resilience and the ability to recover from stress. So again, that kind of folds in with that, the pre-traumatic stress resilience through training design. Like, if I can give you a skill set you're still going to have the same performance in combat, but you'll be very not resilient to stress, or I can give you a skill set that'll give you the same performance in combat, but you'd be very resilient to stress. We should probably build the resilient to stress one, right? Because we have longer operational life cycle, and maybe people a lot less unhappy, after that part of their life is over.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, and that again ties into like, what do our training systems look like? Let's understand the circuitry that we're building, how to build the circuitry, and then if we're doing things in training on purpose that can send people into a state where they can get trauma, why are we doing that? I know we've taken a hard look at that with a lot of the physical stuff recently, where people are like, well, maybe we shouldn't have guys do a 12-mile run on day one because like half the class, like we had half the class out with shin splints, and now like people are rolling out. We lose people who are like really good people with like permanent injuries out of that stuff. Maybe let's train them first. They need to do that, fine, but let's go through the training process. I was talking to a guy recently, military guy, like, kind of about these concepts, and he was like, yeah, like we do all this with physical training, but we don't do it with shooting. So I wonder why we don't do that. I'm like, well, there's never really been tools before, right? And everybody just kind of looked at it like, oh, the thing to do is, let's put as much stress on you as possible because gunfights are stressful. I get that question all the time. I hear it all the time from law enforcement trainers. They're like, I want to get through the qual and then put people under as much stress as I can all the time. I'm like, well, do you want to prepare them for a gunfight or put them under massive amounts of stress and training? Because they might be mutually exclusive. And again, I'm not saying train without stress, like bonbons and, butterflies and stuff. That's not what I'm saying. But when we have a traumatic level, like if we have trauma, injury is the response to that.
So like this, I'm curious about this. I think I wrote this note in the book when I got to that section. One thing I've done with people that I feel need additional training, like I would like to encourage them to get training, as I'd be like, hey, you want to come to a match, an IDPA match or something? Do you think that something, now obviously I'll like go through, I mean, it's safe, it's a safe environment, but do you think that the stress in I'm not talking about some big match either. Not talking, just like a general every other Thursday type match. Right. Do you think the stress in something like that is enough to create the trauma in it? It's probably situation dependent.
No, I don't think so. I mean, where the trauma I think really becomes a problem is because what you're talking about trauma, we're talking about or stuff that's going to impact you operationally. Right. We're talking about the like connecting it to some stimulus in that environment, right? It's like I am now connecting this stimulus in the environment with this stress, right? And now I've got this linkage
The
that
newspaper.
I can't really get right. The newspaper example, right? And that's abstract. That's not a real example, right? But that's an abstract thing of like now I see a newspaper and I go hi and right. My stress levels start going up rather than like, okay, what are the actual pre-attack indicators I should be looking for in this environment, right? Like what are the mannerisms, like, all the other stuff that's actually relevant because the newspaper's not part of that, right? Unless it's intentionally being used as a shielding thing, right? That's a whole separate ball of wax. Dude sitting there with a newspaper is not a pre-attack indicator, right? It could be part of one, but there's other stuff. It's not the newspaper, right? And so that's the risk that we take. In those environments. But I mean, I don't. Yeah, like if somebody's safe, I don't think putting someone in a I don't see any risk putting someone in a shooting competition and being like, wow, it was really stressful. Like, yeah, okay.
I just didn't know if in that context the stress would be more constructive in terms of like, oh, okay, I'm not where I should be. I need to like improve, and that's kind of my goal when I do that. Versus like,
yeah,
oh my gosh, I'm just like so traumatic from this, which again, I don't think that would happen.
No, I don't think that would happen. I mean, I don't think that would happen either. I mean, and the other thing, and this is true across the board too, right? Is it's like, it's not the stimulus that causes the trauma, right? It's the levels of chemical saturation in the brain tissue at the point where the stimulus is experienced that causes the trauma, because that changes how the brain processes. So each individual person is going to have different responses, and that's one of the things that makes it so difficult in training, right? We have often looked at, and we're, I mean, I'm a vendor now too, right? Because I built stuff and sell it, right? So we're incentivized to look for the good, look for the good review, right? Or look for the guy that says, "Oh, this was awesome," or look for the shining example that we can put up and say, "Oh, this worked really well here," But we're not necessarily incentivized to look at the failures. And so yeah, like people will, people who are not redlining it, and you get a lot of guys who are like, man, we need to put people under stress and force on force, right? Who have done a lot of it themselves, right? And they're like, oh yeah, this is great. This is how we learn, right? We get really good at it, not necessarily realizing that they are not sympathetic and force on force, right? And that's why they're learning. That's why they're getting value when they do a ton of runs, right? Because you do enough of it and it's not like it's freaking you out anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like now you're practicing tactics and learning what works and what doesn't work in a tactical setting. And if it's well constructed, there's a lot of value there, but not when you're in the sympathetic red line, right? There's no learning value there. There you're just creating trauma. So people that don't go sympathetic and force on force and, don't necessarily understand what that difference is, can sometimes be like, well, we just need to do more of this, right? And we need to stress people out more. You're not good at this. Let's stress you out more, right? Like that's not necessarily going to be productive, right?
That makes sense.
If you're trying to get somebody there, but yeah, like from putting somebody in a shooting competition, as long as they're safe,
Yeah.
I would certainly do that. So.
I'm curious to hear what you had to say about target versus site focused shooting. We talked a little bit about that,
right.
But maybe what your thoughts are on it, and then also what discoveries have been made by either departments or individuals that have used this device. I would imagine quite a few in terms of like what works and what works and what doesn't work,
right?
That they used to do versus now. Because obviously, if all you have is an auditory stimulus to shoot, well, you can be focused on wherever you want. You can have your eyes closed and still have that auditory stimulus. But when you have to look at something and something that may change and evolve over time as your shot string goes on, well, you're not changing your focal plane continuously between shots to the target back to the... So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I try to stay out of the shooting technique stuff, just in general. But so, yeah, if you have to continuously process information, then you need to gather enough information to solve the problem, right? And so I think where a lot of the target focus versus site focus thing breaks down is that people think target focus shooting is unaimed fire, and that's
right.
That's that is accentuated going back to that what works question, right? Is like so much of the industry has said like, hey, let's do everything at 2 yards or 3 yards, right? And then you can tell somebody whatever it is you want to do at 2 to 3 yards. Reality is that you don't you can point shoot there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't have to build the circuitry that allows you to see the sights because it's harder to see the sights, right? It's definitely harder to see the sights with threat focus because it's not a visual skill we normally use,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if we give people tasks that require them to do that, then there's no other way for them to accomplish the task, and it makes them do that, and it makes them learn those skills.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, like I'm even finding with myself, right? Like, because if we didn't, yeah, like we do the easiest thing, because our brain doesn't want to burn more energy than is necessary. So
Right.
I'm going to do the easiest way to accomplish the task. And if I can accomplish the task easier by, using a suboptimal technique, but that's nonetheless the task I've been asked to solve, then that's what I'll do. Because it's the optimized technique for the task I'm trying to accomplish, not necessarily the optimized technique for what I would need to do in a fight. Right. And that's where it becomes, because of the complexity of shooting skills, and kind of like the different layers that are in them and the difficulty of like, say, like, yeah, you can't put people in like, you can't put people in an hour of real gunfights a day. Right? Like that's that
A lot of liability.
a little bit of a liability. Like it's very resource intensive.
Yeah.
Very high attrition training program there. Right. And even it, yeah. And even if you did that, it would, those skills would be framed by that environment. Right. So like, let's just, again, using the engineering thing, let's take it to the extreme and say we did that in this room, right? You would build skills that allowed you to optimize solving the problem in this room that would not work in the food court at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just would be completely fish out of
Right.
water, unable to solve the problem.
Right.
And so we've done a lot of that. And that's one of the things that's so difficult about teaching these skills is because like, okay, limitations of the range or just, I want you to be able to get feedback and we don't want to have to walk all this way to change targets every time or pace targets or whatever. Okay, I'll put you at 3 yards. Well, now I'm putting you at 3 yards. I want you to shoot, and just hit the torso because I think that's combat relevant action. Well, you don't have to do anything correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you learning? How are you building the circuitry if you don't have to do anything correctly to accomplish the task I've given you? And so like we have like the some of the courses that we're doing, particularly the like vision and marksmanship course that Keith and I have put together, that we're starting to roll out now. Like that's kind of a big component of that is trying to get people to understand it's not about whether or not what we're doing during training or during every training repetition is a replication of a gunfight, is what we're doing in the training repetition, building the circuitry that will give you the performance in the gunfight, right? Is it building the gunfighting circuitry? Because those are two potentially different things, Oh, well, let's stand at 2 yards and launch rounds. Okay, well, that's not what a 2 yard gunfight looks like, right? So you're not really using the circuitry that you need at 2 yards to do that, and you're not building any of the shooting mechanics because you don't need them there. And so at the point where the mechanics that give you the torso shot at 2 yards have become how you handle a gun, now you've put a huge barrier to yourself at being able to solve any other problems, right? Because the way you grip the gun is not going to enable you to manage recoil now, right?
Yeah.
Potentially, right?
Right. That makes sense. Where can people get it?
Neuro?
Yeah.
So currently, you can go on and ask for a quote at buildingshooters.com. We're kind of slow rolling it out to the civilian side. Again, because we're like some of the software is still in beta, particularly on the mobile app and stuff like that. But it should be, I'd say the next month or two, it should be up. Actually, we'll be able to buy them on the website or order them. But now you can go on. It should just be request a quote on buildingshooters.com.
I'll have a link.
The front page. Yeah, there you go.
And where can people find out more about you? We got this. I've been talking about it.
Same thing. Buildingshooters.com is kind of the stopping point there. So there's a bunch. I think we've got 60 something articles up there now. That's all free. Like all the content on the site's free. Obviously, you can buy the books if you want to buy the books. That's cool.
They're good.
I'm a fan of people buying the books, buying Neuros, obviously. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation.
It has been. It's been fun.
Super interesting. So I'm
we went way down some rabbit holes.
It's great.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited about what you guys are doing, and I think that it's going to take the training community in the right direction.
That's certainly the goal, right? There's just, And I mean, and that was kind of the realization that led the neuro is like, there's all these kind of like little changes, you know, they're seismic changes kind of at a neurological level, but they're not necessarily huge resource changes, right, or anything. But they're just little things that we've done for so long that are so bad for the students. They're so bad for learning. Like, I can't see my shot splits when I shoot, right? Because like there's 15 people online and everybody's shooting, or I know what I always know what I'm going to do before I do it. Well, now I don't have to use most of the circuit board that I need in a gunfight. And so just, you know, yeah, that was the point, right? Like, how do we get something out there that enables us to solve that problem? So
That's awesome.
yeah.
Well, Dusty, thanks again.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for watching. And as always, train to a higher standard.